Welcome everybody. It's amazing to have this special episode of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors here in the International Facilitation Week. This is an event organized, hosted by the International Association of Facilitators. And guess what? We have 3 members here in this call. It's great that you are taking time to watch us on a Sunday, even though we are recording this on a Friday. But it's terrific that you can take your time to watch this episode, and I'm obviously here to answer all your comments as you watch us now. With me today, my co-host Martin Duffy. Martin, good to see you here.
Afternoon, everybody. Yeah, good to see you again, Paul. How are you?
And it's good to have you on board. Also as guests to known facilitators, I have members, Sue Bird from Europe, working in Brussels and chair of IF chapter. Hi, Sue.
Yep. Good afternoon. Good morning. Good afternoon, wherever you are.
Absolutely. That's the spirit. And from the North America, we have Michael Randall, a dear friend, also IF member, CPF. Michael, good to have you on show.
It's nice to be here. Thank you. And I'll just round it out by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening from around the world.
Absolutely.
Well said,
absolutely. And Martin, over to you. We normally start with a kind of question, right?
Yeah, we normally try to open up with just asking our honored guests if there's anything in particular about yourself that people generally might not be familiar with, but might give people an opportunity to get to know you a little bit more deeply than will be the normal case in a group discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can go first if you like, Michael. I don't mind doing that. Yeah.
Please.
Well, perhaps a lesser known something about me, because it's not on my CV or LinkedIn profile, I don't think it is at least, is that I'm quite a football fan. And I'm very interested recently in the Women's World Cup as well as the men's, following the men's tournaments. And I even went to Qatar last year to follow England, because I live and work in Brussels in Belgium, and I've in fact got Belgian nationality, but I've also got UK nationality, which are my origins. So you always go back to your origins, and England has to be the team for me.
Super. Yeah, really interesting. Wow. Michael?
Well, yes, it's talking about origins. So people assume that because I live in Washington, D.C., I must be American. My accent then tends to confuse them.
Yeah.
And so I had a kind of a global childhood, lived in a number of different countries growing up.
Super.
But pertinent for today and origins, born in Ireland and lived there for a number of years with my Irish family. And we also lived in South Africa for a number of years, and I sort of grew up in South Africa, did my schooling and early career there. And what's pertinent right now is the Rugby World Cup is going on. There are 2 teams that wear green, Ireland and South Africa. And if we really are true about it, I'm rooting for Ireland. They've got a fantastic team this year. South Africa's had time being world champions. They've done it enough. Let's go Ireland.
Okay, cool.
Very good. Yeah, super. It's well, I suppose actually it was interesting in our last discussion, that very question segued us into the substantive content of our actual discussion with our previous 2 guests. But our maybe we can segue, Michael, from your comment there about measuring performance, and in a World Cup competition, you know, is the measure of performance really about who raises the cup, or is there some other way that we can measure performance? And then if we translate that into our teams around us, which is really the subject matter that we thought yourself and Sue might be able to make a significant contribution on. What do we measure? How do we measure? Do we know that what we're measuring is of any benefit to anybody? There's 100 questions we could probably start with, but I'll just open the floor to both of you for your initial ideas or thoughts on measuring our team performances.
It's a great question. Sue, I'm curious, with your experience working in the European Commission and places like that, lots of teams set up for all sorts of reasons. What did you see? What have you learned about assessing the performance and productivity of teams?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think, it's an issue which is always behind anything that any public organization does, or indeed the private sector, because time as a resource is more and more valuable these days. So efficient use of time in whatever that way that may mean in terms of productivity related to results of a meeting, actionable points, the extent to which actionable points are then taken up, subsequently monitored and reviewed. I think those are the sort of key metrics, quite obvious ones really, but key metrics that I'd be looking to ensure that we do. We measure for a reason, and we measure because presumably we want to monitor progress over time, and we want to improve over time in whatever meeting space we're working and whatever subjects we're working with, some of which will be more complex than others. Some will be short term, some will be medium term, some will be longer term. I look at actionable points, my starting point, look at actionable points, and then look at how the implementation of those points is looking over time through good monitoring processes.
What you're saying makes me think about maybe the formal measures that might be in place, and then the informal measures that often are the ones that count. Right. So I worked for some years with an international financial institution, and its business was making loans to countries to support economic and social development. And it was really interesting because the success of the team was measured in how long did it take them to get from the concept to board approval of the loan. Right. And then that was the point of celebration and success. The team leader had done a great job by getting the loan approved. The champagne, corks were popping, everybody was celebrated. The team leader went on to their promotion and moving forward. And then, simply left behind was the question of implementation, which got often passed down to a more junior person to now be the team leader. And it could be several years before that project would be finally fully implemented. And obviously takes a bit longer to be able to really assess the impact. So you could look at what are all the formal marks along the way of success and progress and productivity. But I think there's often a sort of an underculture which really focuses on what matters in this culture. And in that institution, what mattered seemed to be getting loans approved rather than the successful implementation of those loans and the development impact it would make in countries and the impact on people's lives.
Yeah, I suppose, Michael, you might ask yourself, well, why visibly was the emphasis so much on getting the loan approved, as opposed to what you might think is the more important part, which is actually getting the money out to the beneficiaries, enabling, and making sure then the beneficiaries implement over a period of time. Organizations are quite self-driven and have to be seen to be effective, particularly public sector organizations, because of the public funding, the accountability of the public funding involved. So I wonder in that case if this institution was actually rather mindful of its own status. And clearly, if you can visibly say you've approved X number of loans over an X timescale, amounting to X AB amount of funding for X number of projects, that's really clear achievements as far as the institution is concerned. Right. And I suppose it depends then the extent to which you are examined both publicly and privately as to the quality of the implementation of those projects. And I would have thought, over time that the latter point would ultimately have been more important in terms of accountability than, which I presume, well, the institution would have been accountable, you know, than more important, the implementation side than the actual setting up of the loan and approval of the loan in the first place. Yeah.
Actually, it's interesting from both of your comments. Two things are jumping into my mind from what you've said so far. One is timescale over which we choose to measure, and the second is performance versus productivity. So maybe if we dealt with the performance versus productivity piece initially, and we might just loop back to the timescale question, because I think they might be related to each other. But that idea of performance versus productivity and measuring, like the classic euphemism that a lot of organizations would use: if you don't measure it, it never got done. But would you subscribe to that view of the world when we come to performance measurement versus productivity output measurement? What would your thoughts be on that?
Well, I was, just thinking as you were saying that, Martin. Frederick Taylor came to mind. The sort of time studies expert from 1900, walking around a factory with a stopwatch and a clipboard, and like really tracking each person and how long did they take and how long could they do it, how could they do it faster, and really focusing on efficiency. He was in factories. We got very concrete, very tangible widgets, let's just say, being assembled, produced. And so there's and I think there the time scale is much shorter. Maybe you're looking at days or even hours, right? So there's a very tangible way of counting productivity and how to increase efficiency to make that happen. With the financial institution that I was working in, gosh, sometimes 2-3 years to get the loan approved, and then maybe 7 years for it to be implemented, right? Yeah. So if you think of somebody's career, like I'm in this team, I'm the team leader perhaps, I don't want to wait 10 years to be assessed to whether or not I've been productive and made a difference. So I think what people tend to do is they look for proxy indicators, right? Which is, unfortunately, then gets us into this trap that where busyness and activity gets counted as being a measure of team performance, rather than the higher order questions, which are more complex, they're more entangled. There's many more things that contribute to whether or not that's going to happen. So it's less easy to say, this impact was achieved by that very effective team. So people want to shorten the timescales. They want to focus on what's concrete and measurable. And those are not always the key elements in the eventual success and impact of a team.
Yeah, that's interesting, Michael, because you're very much focusing there on I think on the operational side, operations, as opposed to, some of the conceptual stuff which might go on behind. And, Marty's question was about performance and productivity, and I would lean towards the performance side in my own concept of maybe what you think to yourself, well, what is most valuable at the end of the day? And there's all sorts of contributions to value, but we should not forget the value of the softer contributions to discussions, to operational processes, the thinking that goes on behind the strategizing. The mission has to be linked to a mission of a particular unit or a department, or in a big institution, or where I'm used to what we used to call a directorate general. And you maybe have particular teams or particular individuals within particular teams who have a very well-founded conceptual approach, in the sense that you have people there of varying ages who come in with really good ideas. And looking at performance of a team over time, again, and measuring performance, then one should be able to see, and it's more, this is far more difficult to measure, but one should be able to see great ideas, you know, so long as they're not so fantastic ideas that they're sort of outside the culture, you know, it's not acceptable to the culture of the organization, or they're not realistic in terms of being implementable. But assuming those points are present, then you probably will see some evidence of implementation of those ideas, in the sense of them appearing in strategy documents and then being translated into objectives and then being translated into operational projects. You know, that's how I see things having come together over quite a long time scale there. But measuring that in terms of productivity would be quite difficult. But measuring it, or monitoring it and evaluating it and reviewing it in terms of performance might be the way to go with that.
Yeah, and that poses an interesting dilemma. Michael, you touched on it there on this idea of quantification. There's a piece of research that I did myself ways back, where I worked with a team for a day, and having reviewed the transcript of the conversations, I did a kind of a quantitative assessment of who contributed most during the meeting. But then I looked at it from a completely different point of view, and I looked at it to say, who had the most profound impact on the direction or the content or the outcome of the day's proceedings? And actually, it turned out that quantitatively, the person who contributed least seemed to have the most profound impact on the team or the group's actual, let's say, strategic plan output, because it was a strategic planning session. I found that remarkable, because if you were the fly on the wall, which I partly was, although I was the facilitator, when you observe, you kind of go, that person was very passive, they were very quiet. But afterwards, when you reflected, which I was now doing in an academic sense, when I reflected on the transcript, I discovered, by accident and by partly design, the person contributing least quantitatively was contributing most qualitatively.
Right.
So could I ask
but that
you,
Martin, that brings something up for me. I don't know if you're familiar with the acronym of HIPPO, which is the highest paid person's opinion. Right? And
like
this may or may not have been the case in that room, but often, no matter the quality of the ideas or the quantity of contributions, in many places, because of hierarchy, power, dynamics, et cetera, the ultimate decision comes down to, well, what's the highest paid person's view about this? Often that's the leader or the director, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And of course, healthy teams don't fall into that trap, you know, that the leader is actually able to be an enabler and a facilitator of the team process. So it's not, they might speak last and say just one thing, but it's what we're going to do, versus they create the container within which the team does its work, and they seek out and invite diverse views, and they take care with how they put their own ideas forward, so they don't end up squashing discussion and things like that.
Yeah, Michael, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that brings the whole nature of facilitation in, because, you know, a common understanding of facilitation is that we as facilitators work in a participatory, inclusive, bottom-up process. And, you know, some of the processes that I've worked in, I actively encourage I'm sure this is quite common, you know, it's not unknown, this, but I actively encourage the leaders, the managers, for the time of the facilitation to actually see themselves as completely equal with, you know, the people they would normally lead. And that, you know, that creates different dynamics. And I think, generally speaking, that's quite well accepted by other participants in the meeting as well, while bearing in mind that that particular person will probably step out at the beginning of the meeting to head things off, and then the facilitated session, and then at the end, you know, stand up to make some closing remarks as well. So, you know, should we say, Martin was referring to individuals who may be stand out, but not necessarily because they're vocal. I would say, yes, individuals, but yes, equally group processes, because I'm very much a believer that one may have what we may think are brilliant ideas. Wow, you know, gosh, what a light, you know, suddenly a light appears in your head and you've got that really good idea. But obviously, or honestly, those ideas are going to be refined, built upon, expanded, stuff taken away when you actually debate it with other people. And the key to the best performance of teams, I think, is being able to honestly and openly and in a trusting way, you know, share these views that everybody will have and their knowledge and experience to be able to come up with the best solution that a team can come up with. And there you put in place the benchmark, the basis for you know, great performance and potentially, you know, the ability to properly and well monitor implementation as you go forward.
Yeah, and that actually, those 2 points that both of you have made, actually, maybe that's an appropriate time to loop us back to that second question that I posed, which is this idea of the time scale over which we choose to measure performance and or productivity. That if we measure over a week, a month, a quarter, a half year, a year, a 3-year strategic cycle, are we measuring really fundamentally different things? And that's then going to beg the question, which we might come to a little bit later. So how do we go about effectively measuring these different elements within the teams that we lead? So the first question is that time scale point, very short term versus very long term, or something in between. Any thoughts on that? What's appropriate to measure, how to go about measure?
I've got two. Actually, I've got a picture in mind, a vision in mind of trying to visibly and graphically, photographically, if you like, present what you're suggesting, Martin. And that is the longer the term we're looking at, the greater the eyes are going to look up. So in other words, to look at the sky, look at the clouds, maybe planes flying across the sky. And the shorter the term we're looking at in terms of measuring performance or productivity of initiatives of individual organizations, private sector, public sector, institutions, whatever, you know, we maybe think about life. We maybe think about people moving, traveling on our Earth. So the sort of typically blue sky stuff, you know, blue sky thinking or whatever, that's the highest level thinking, you know, and be up in stratosphere somewhere. And then the conceptual and strategic stuff, which is being worked on to come up with concrete proposals later down the line, but a longer term process would be, you know, aeroplanes in the sky, and then the implementation, the operational side, the everyday, the concrete tasks that we all perform from 1 hour, 1 day to the next, you know, are all of us living our lives and moving around and interacting actually on the Earth where we are now. That's sort of my view.
The visual, yeah. No, I can see the picture you're conjuring up in the mind's eye there, Sue, for sure. Michael, thoughts on that?
Yeah. So here's me try and get this into a phrase. Measuring systems are inherently rational and linear and additive. Life, reality, teamwork, project work is neither rational nor linear, and often not additive.
Yeah.
Right. So let's just imagine, you know, the result a group is working towards, this sort of their deliverable is a new policy, right, to be adopted and implemented by the organization. On one hand, there's a sort of a linear timescale that talks about assemble the team, consultations, public meetings, drafting documents, reviews, adoption, implementation. And there's a sort of a idealized timeline that gets created. But then if you look underneath the surface, how is the team actually doing that? They're not probably going in a straight line. They're sort of zigzagging all over the place. They might have to be taking steps back. They might be catapulted forward. So that's, I think, part of the challenge of trying to say the team's productivity or performance is measured that by month 6, they had completed 6 stakeholder consultations. You know, often you've maybe done 2, but the other 4 happen in the next month. You know, so it becomes a bit of a fake measure. Both teams, you know, one that might follow more of a simpler, maybe more linear process, both teams could get to the same result, but they could have followed very different ways to get there.
Yeah.
And I would even hazard that the team that had the more complex path that kind of got reset a couple of times as they got new perspective and new awareness might actually have a higher quality result because they were not just following a timeline and checking boxes as they went along.
I'm reminded actually, Michael, of when I used to work for a public organization, and I was just making the transition to the private sector. In fact, I retired in inverted commas from the public organization, but I've set myself up as a consultant in between times. And talking to an ex-colleague who'd done the same thing, he very interestingly said, look, you know, where we used to work, the processes were very linear, and the relationships were quite linear. Let me say to you, let me warn you, then in the private sector, that's a bit different. You know, so he was clearly sort of comparing and contrasting public sector with private sector, and that I can't remember what word he actually used, but it was non-linear in the sort of way that you're talking about, Michael. And I do agree, you know, that in the longer, and it's possibly longer term, and this is why, you know, if you put yourself in a bit of a straitjacket and say, yeah, we're going to deliver ABC within XYZ timetable, and it's not carefully chosen, it proves to be unrealistic, then you know, even failure is on the cards. So it behoves to think very clearly, logically, and even conceptually about the way you monitor and what you monitor over time. And I completely agree that, you know, these more complex non-linear processes are often richer in terms of outcomes and implementation than if one is too fixed on, you know, the aims and objectives and measurable KPIs that you've set up along the way.
So does that effectively mean that if we take a strategy for any organization, let's say we take a 2-year or a 3-year strategy, that at the end of 3 years, we can measure the team. So whether it's a small team or a big team, we can measure the team's performance notionally by saying, yes, we delivered on the strategy, or no, we didn't. But along the way, we have these week, month, quarterly, 6 months, we have these punctuation points. And the way in which we measure at these punctuation points necessarily has to be fundamentally different to the way that we're going to measure at the end of a bigger chunk of work. Is that a fair point? And if that is a fair point, how do we differentiate one time frame measurement from the next bigger time frame measurement?
Yeah, I think there's a difference maybe between quantity and quality. And I think, you know, you can, I mean, quantifying is relatively easy, you know, because we distill it down to details. But when you talk about quality, there we're linking into performance again. And I can't help thinking that, you know, we always need a narrative. So attached to any implementation schedule, results oriented activity with milestones, against specific targets or KPIs that you set up in advance. Okay, there's a certain rhythm to that over time, and perhaps some plan Bs here and there, and times when there can be alterations to the time scale at particular review points or something like that. But I always think and possibly the most important point, and perhaps the most interesting part, is the narrative, because there you accompanying your implementation, your results and what you've managed to achieve in quantitative terms, you're letting your public know that actually within that process we encountered this, we encountered that, we built on this because it was a particular success, or we had this problem, so we tackled it and then we stepped beyond it, and this is what we did. And then in terms of your results at the end of the day, the anecdotes and the stories that come out are equally as important in my view, as the facts, as the facts and figures, in particular the figures, the measurement that we're talking about. Now, go back to Michael's original point about the financial institution and them wanting to focus on a particular aspect of their activity. When you get to the stage where you have implemented and you've got a stream of data alongside some stories and anecdotes and analysis, narrative analysis, which is going to be most important to the public to communicate? Well, the media love, facts and figures, don't they? Figures and particularly stark facts as well. The narrative, the explanation, the complexities, which requires a bit more reading, a bit more, has to be digested, perhaps over time, is not always as easy. But I would argue, as important, if not more important, than your linear quantified stuff.
Yeah, and actually I've got a story that is in my mind that really brings these dynamics out. So I want to talk about basically a team that existed for 3 weeks and delivered on its mission, its product, its purpose. So I was a member of this team. It was a 4-member team doing a midterm evaluation of an environmental project in Southeast Asia, which was being funded by a European government. And the idea of a midterm evaluation is it's formative, right? So you're coming in along the way, seeing how the project and the project team is performing, and then forming a view as to, well, how are they progressing, and what feedback, what advice do we have for what they can do or need to do to make sure that they're able to hit the project goals by the end of the project. So on one level, we were a very productive team because we wrote and presented our report to the embassy and to the project owner on deadline, right? What was not so visible was that I was the one who gave the presentation. I happened to be the most junior, youngest member of the team. I was the one who gave the presentation because I was literally the last person standing. It had been a highly conflictual team. These 4 people had never met before. We'd been put together by the client. Our team dynamic never really worked well. People were distracted by other assignments. There was tension and different perspectives. And, we kind of gave the presentation, presented our report. And so the agency was able to check a box, midterm evaluation completed. But I'm not sure that our product had much impact because we were trying to inform and influence how this project's going to go forward. And again, I'm not sure that our findings were fully adopted and owned by the client to be able to make changes in how they were proceeding. So, I think that this, part of this thing is this challenge of these external markers can sort of give a false view as to performance and productivity. And so, I'd be very interested to kind of go in and unpack how do we look at how the team is doing?
Yeah.
Sort of in parallel, maybe not completely separate, but in parallel from how it's tracking on metrics of progressing along a timeline or steps in a process.
Michael, question to you. Do you think that's linked to the performance of the leader of the team, or do you think it's genuinely, you know, a sort of bottom-up inclusive team thing per se?
I think the team leader definitely has a influence. And these days, so many teams that people are part of are not kind of permanent, fixed, bounded teams. People are moving across multiple teams in the course of their day. Some teams, they're the lead. Other teams, they're a subject matter expert. Other teams, they're an advisor. And so, you know, Amy Edmondson, who's known nowadays a lot around psychological safety, she had written a book some years ago called Teaming. And the idea is that, you know, one way you can do is, rather than just focusing on developing a team as an intact team and how they work together, another angle is you help all the members of a group develop the skills of teaming, how they enter and contribute to teams and how they leave, because that's the reality, right? So you don't have time necessarily for team building, team formation, but because everybody knows how to team, the teams have a higher chance of being effective together.
Yeah. Sue, you said something really interesting there, and Michael, your immediate response was equally interesting as I listened to both of you. So you made the point about the media loves the quantitative, you know, they love the soundbite and so on. And Michael, in your immediate response, you said, I've got a story to tell.
Indeed. Yeah.
So with every team, the media love a personal story. If we can put a person around the narrative, or if we can put a narrative around the person, we may have a chance of bypassing a little bit of the hard quantitative and actually bringing forward some of the that qualitative. So here's my question out of that observation from what both of you have said. And Michael, you touched on it then in your last comment. When we now look at teams collectively, but then we need to start looking at the performance stroke productivity of individuals within the teams. How do we balance both of those? And I'm mindful to go back to my original anecdote of that person who spoke least and appeared to have the biggest influence. So how, in your opinion, do we balance those two elements? This thing of the individual's contribution, not necessarily quantitatively, but actually more qualitatively, versus the quantitative against which we are more likely to measure the performance of the overall collective. How do we balance both of those in your views?
That's interesting, Martin, because you know, you're talking there about you know, all sorts of different influences which could affect implementation of a project over time, and how a team or teams in the context, but Michael was making it work together. But I think we've touched on this, but not specifically. I don't think we should forget the human element in contributions to team processes. And you know, your interesting example of the person who has the most influence has potentially the least to say. Now, you know, you start thinking to yourself, well, what sort of personality does that person have then? You know, obviously, I suppose, you know, I have in my mind, it would be a person with quite some gravitas, you know, whatever that means. Maybe they have seniority in terms of age. Maybe they have seniority in terms of perception as to ability to strategize and conceptualize. Maybe they are leaders. You know, maybe they are nominated leaders within the team, or, you know, maybe it's a visitor from the outside. I don't know. You know, a more senior person who's in that meeting for a specific reason. But if you take it that it's someone who's a member of the team and who more or less has some sort of authority, then personality is clearly going to play a role. You know, you could conversely have other people, you know, the other end of the spectrum, who are quiet and you know, are shy, you know, are a little bit shy by nature, so their influence on the meeting may be less. And in that sort of context, you need, we know very well, don't we, as facilitators, you need skilled facilitators or leaders, skilled leaders, to be able to, you know, enable everyone to participate. So the person who hasn't got so much to say but has gravitas has an equal view to the person who hasn't got so much to say equally, but for different reasons. And clearly because, you know, that person perhaps is new, less knowledgeable, has a role which is not central to the discussion that's ongoing, is a bit shy. But, you know, we all bring to meetings our operational, our job description, our tasks on the everyday, which is more the sort of rational, linear. But then around that is clearly our personalities, you know, the human, non-linear, the complex. I mean, what's more complex than a human personality? And what's even more complex, to get so many different, you know, individual human personalities working together. I mean, what a dynamic, what a promising dynamic, what opportunities. You know, and it's that side, I think, which interests me, to very much complement, if not encapsulate the and ultimately become more important than, you know, the linear, the measurable, the implementable, the operational.
And we have to think about time, Martin and Sue. Sorry to break the good mood of this conversation so far and the food for thought we're sharing here. I think our viewers are delighted, as I am listening here. I got my takeaway with IPO. Love that, Michael. And the teaming skills. This could be an opportunity for facilitators to be hired by big corporations, big organizations, to have a facilitator on duty to avoid the IPO on any meeting, right? The highest paid opinion in a meeting can spoil everything. And for our colleagues, coaches, team coaching could be also mandatory in order to have these tickets. But then over to you, Martin, because you normally summarizes everything so nicely.
Yeah, it's I haven't been able to take notes, but I've been trying to mentally track, I guess, the conversation that we've had so far. We started like our theme of measuring productivity versus performance. And I suppose that's where we separated out the idea of performance versus productivity. And I think it's fair to say that we came to the rough conclusion that productivity is relatively easy because it's quantitative. But performance, while performance can be reflected in the quantitative, it doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story. And because it's not telling us the whole story, that then brought us into the conversation of monitoring or managing performance versus productivity of the collective versus the contribution of individuals to that collective. And I think that was partly, Michael, where you brought in the HIPO or hypo, which I love that particular idea as well. That partly reflected into the anecdote I provided myself of the person who contributes least may, in some instances, actually contribute most when measured from a slightly different perspective. So I guess that then brought us into our conversation about the time frame over which we choose to measure things. So if we're measuring against very short term, and Michael, you gave us the wonderful example of a 3-week piece of work that quantitatively can get measured against a report, a box ticked, but actually under the surface, we might discover not such a well-functioning team, probably not a team that's going to come back together again, probably an investment of time and resource that actually may not have produced nearly as much long-term productivity as we might have reasonably expected. So that concept of if we measure something over a very short time versus over a very long period, how we go about measuring that, we need to be careful about. so that we actually measure, I suppose, the most indicative elements that are going to differentiate between the individual's performance versus the collective team performance. I think it's probably fair to say, in summary of our discussion, it's not as simple as just count the number of widgets that were produced at the end of the production line. When we come to the human person-people dynamic, and I think this is a key point, Sue, that you brought out, was we are absolutely people before we are machines. And in being people, measuring what we do, how we do it, and then more importantly, and Sue, I'm now leaning back into something you said, how we do it in conjunction with other people now becomes a really important challenge, so that we then focus on measuring the correct things in the most appropriate way. And it may not always be about quantitative. In fact, it probably won't be always only about quantitative. And we just need to be cautious that we don't measure the wrong thing and end up getting a potentially wrong result.
Absolutely. That's why, dear viewers,
Wonderful.
if you need anything, contact these wonderful meeting doctors we have here with us today. We are here to assist on any matter that you can think about when gathering people, right? Okay, so last piece of takeaway, Sue, Michael, from the conversation, and we close the mic for today.
Yeah, I think for me, this lovely, challenging combination of the operational, the rational, the linear, with the human, the complex, and the a little bit ephemeral as well, ephemerality. I mean, gosh, how do you measure that? But what a challenge, you know, what a challenge to bring those together and create team processes, implementation of projects in an optimal way.
Mm-hmm. I'm feeling sort of very animated and warmed up around this topic, because there's a lot you could say. So let me add one different element. The focus on metrics and measuring often assumes, I think, to some extent, that there's a predefinition of what to monitor. Yeah. And I think it's really important to be open and curious to what's going to come in from the side that gives you data about what's going on. It may not match to an existing metric you're tracking, but it can be very important of this is what's going on and this is what needs attention.
Absolutely. And that's all for today, folks. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you so much for taking your time to watching us on a Sunday. Of course, you are also able to watch us throughout the week, as this is going to be on LinkedIn Live. Thank you so much, dear guest speakers, Sue, Michael, and Martin. Amazing summary, even without your notes today. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
so good to be here with all of you, dear followers, in the month of August. But we noticed from last year that August has awesome participation. So it seems that people are more relaxed on vacation, whatever. We have so many viewers in August that we decided to do this episode in August. And right, Martin, it was your idea to invite these renowned speakers.
Absolutely. We've had some really interesting and stimulating discussions with both Elise and Gustavo in the past. So we thought it might be useful to come back, have another little chat, and this time to combine the expertise that Elise brings, which is very definitely around meetings and organizing and managing meetings, and Gustavo's experience, which is all around organization culture. And we thought a fitting topic might be the idea of building a meetings positive organization culture. So we thought that could be a stimulating conversation with two world experts in the respective fields.
That's awesome. That's really the case. And we normally start these episodes with a question, right, Martin?
Yeah, the question, it's not always heard very positively, Paul, as we discovered in one of our episodes, but that's fine. That's the nature of live broadcast and just engaging with people in our fireside chat format. Both Elise and Gustavo will have answered this question for us before, but more than happy to hear any new takes they have on it. Something that people may not always know about you, that is just a little bit interesting.
Sure. Elise?
Well, let's see. I have today a growing collection of necklaces with double-headed war axes on them.
Oh.
Inspired by Wilbert von Vrie, who is a meeting historian.
Absolutely, yeah.
Who pointed out that the modern gavel is a descendant from the double-headed war axe. And so I pointed this out in a training once, and I told this story, and I ended up with a collection of these gavels from Wilbert, who has them custom made. And my dad decided that then I collect double-headed war axes, and he sends me necklaces and T-shirts and giant Viking mugs. This is not the case, but now you know, you too can send me double-headed war axe things.
Super. Wow. Oh, I love it. Nice one.
Can you beat this, Gustavo?
No, but that's not a competition, it's a contribution. So I'm going to talk about a personal story that very few people know, that was a life-changing event, which I got lost in the Andes, like exploring a mountain. I got lost from a team, and then I had to survive one night that it felt like a week in the middle of the wilderness, without proper clothing, without food, without water, without anything, without lights, in a place that I then realized it was full of mountain lions. Luckily, they weren't able to visit, or they didn't think I was the right kind of food for them. So it was a very life-changing, and since then I adopted the idea of getting lost on purpose. No, so now I go biking, and sometimes I take a turn without knowing where I am and keep biking for miles, and then I say, well, now I need to figure out how to get my way home, back home.
Very interesting. Wow. A lot of crikey, we could have a conversation just on that one, Gustavo. As the implications of that for organization culture could be fairly significant.
Yes, and especially meeting culture, right?
Oh yeah, wow.
Yeah, there was a meeting with
Intentional
myself,
dips
but in the
into
end, it's all
chaos.
about mindset. No, so it's like if you don't stop and pause, like yeah, you're dead, literally.
Yeah, it evokes something pretty interesting, though. The idea of going someplace that you don't know, that you're not familiar with, and getting more and more comfortable with where it might take you. What an interesting idea. Elise, any experience along those lines from a meetings perspective?
Well, I think it's part of what leads to the advice that we often give clients, which is to, just relax. Relax on the agendas, relax on all of these trying to over control and constrain things and thinking that that's what will make it look successful. You know, sometimes come up with a provocative question and go for a walk, right? Is one of the better ways in which to get lost in the terrain of possibility, right? You know, that's what makes meetings worth doing, when you discover that you can overcome the mountain lions together.
Absolutely. And building on that, I like the idea that, yeah, people think that when meetings are chaotic because there's no outcome, that they basically need to jump into the other extreme, which is basically over control. But maybe the solution is learn to navigate the chaos rather than avoid it or try to eliminate it, because that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, and that's that I'm conjuring what both of you were saying to me is setting all kinds of bells ringing in my head here about meeting positive culture, because is it not the case that we so often hear negativity as soon as we mention the word meeting, that it conjures up all this kind of ferment of negativity? But what both of you are saying in very different ways, but aligning, is there's massive positivity in navigating the unknown, the unfamiliar. And are there lessons that we could take from that idea if we wanted to build meeting positive workspaces and workplaces?
Well, I think you have to start with being a little bit comfortable with the unknown and the unfamiliar if you're going to go from a place that is status quo to a place that's meeting positive. Just because the status quo discussion around meetings is so negative. So even embracing the idea that we might think this is something we can play with is an unknown and risky place to go, and yet a delightful one.
But where's the risk? Where's the risk in that, Elise, from your experience? Why would people do on that?
It's social. So you know, people talk about like meetings being determined based on, you know, lack of agenda or having an agenda, you know, managing it to 15 minutes or not managing it to 15 minutes, having these sort of organizational wide rules that are then enforced as being the keys to success. And it doesn't ever work. It never works to just put in these bands and these top level constraints, because the real challenge is not the absence or presence of dictated agreements of performance. The real challenge is meetings are a social gathering event for teams. And you walk into the room, and the way that you behave in the room is the way that the group in the room behaves. So for you to come in and say, hey, you know what, let's have some fun here. Hey, let's play some music. You know what, we're just going to put a question up and see what happens. Why don't we take this for a walk? Anytime you do that, you run the risk of the rest of the group thinking that you are unprofessional, judging them. Are you saying we've been doing it wrong, right? Wasting their time. You're dealing with social risk. It's like you're trying to bring another country's culture into your parents' dining table. Good luck with that. So that's the risk. And the framing question, the unknown, is how do you step boldly into the place where you don't know how to survive quite? You don't know that environment and thrive in it.
And Gustavo, isn't that the essence of organization culture? It's this idea of preformed expectations, preformed rules, things that we conform to, things that we adhere to. And are we at the risk? Does culture potentially crush creativity? And in a meetings context, does prevailing culture in the organizations kill the possibility of doing stuff better or differently or both?
Mm-hmm. Lots of things to unpack there, trying to see where I get started. First of all, I think that I 1000% agree with Elise many times people want to put too much process in place, and that doesn't help, and especially because it comes with a band-aid approach. So we're trying to fix things rather than try to understand what's the real underlying cause. So that's when culture comes to life. First, what are the mindsets, the issues that are affecting meetings? So to your point, they're not things that are negative or positive. We can turn negative things into a good thing, or we can do the opposite. So it's up to us. There are many types of culture. I'm going to try to keep it simple here, but for example, there are certain organizations that have what I call more of a tribal, like a friendly type of culture, in which those meetings tend to happen very organically. Let's take IKEA or Zappos. IKEA has huge staircases in most of their offices that promote impromptu encounters for people to have what they call in Swedish a fika, coffee, and then meet with your friends, chat about life, and one things get to another. That's how they roll. The opposite extreme, very aggressive culture like Amazon, Netflix, they have very structured, rigid, efficient-oriented meetings. So, for example, in Netflix, meetings are never meant to make decisions. They are very structured. They have always an agenda. They always start and end on time. And if you don't show up on time, you can get fired. So very rigid. Amazon has this idea of the 2-pizza rule, never invite more people to a meeting than those that you can fit to a pizza. So they want to keep it small. So depending on the culture that affects that, what I see is that many times companies have a very, for example, what I call fearless, very top-down, controlling, lot of red tape culture. They want to adopt meetings in a more creative or innovative or free flow, and then they fail because basically that's not how they roll. They're not prepared. They don't know how to facilitate. They're not ready to have conversations that are courageous or difficult, or they're not. I mean, if you invite them to go for a walk and let's have a walking meeting, they say, "Oh, what is this?" So that's not going to happen. No? So I think that's every organization has the meetings that their culture deserves. That doesn't mean that they don't deserve better.
Wow. So that's and so Elise, I'd bounce back to you on that one. So what I'm actually hearing from both of you is that the already existing culture of the organization gets reflected in its meetings. But Elise, I think if I understood your point correctly, that by adopting different types of meetings, we have the possibility to maybe shift a little bit the underlying organization culture. Have we got a hen and an egg scenario going on here between meetings and org culture?
Always, right? So, and I think Gustavo and I probably hugely overlap in terms of the things that we work on with clients on, because, you know, while I'm not a huge fan of giant top-down mandates, it does require you to make some new agreements if you're looking to shift your culture. And those agreements get proven and enacted and iterated on when the teams come together. So that's the meeting, right? So the meeting, in terms of cultural shift, is the one place where everybody is all in the same room practicing what they just said they were going to do. It's the one place where you can, you know, get those iterations in and do that time to say, yes, indeed, we are in fact going to hear from everybody. We are in fact going to write down what we agreed to do, right? So while the meeting is a reflection of the culture, it's also a creator of the culture at the same time, which is why I focus on it as an intervention point, but it is by no means something that stands on its own. It's also a fabulous diagnostic tool. So if you look at some of those top-down hierarchical organizations, they're breaking down, right? That, you know, a Taylorist approach to work is not scaling, and it's not agile enough for the current dynamic environment that we live in. And so we see this giant proliferation of the ad hoc meeting. You know, all the people who have to check in with so-and-so and so-and-so. And in those cases, those meetings are a symptom of the existing processes being unfit for purpose. You can't get things done in the structure, in the red tape that need to be done. So therefore, you have to meet with a bunch of people to figure out how to move forward, because there is no mechanism for moving forward in that structure. So the cultural gridlock that happens there because because you're so stuck in all of these patterns and have literally no time to get out of them, has to be shifted by creating new agreements and iterating your way through it.
Wow. Gustavo, that bounces into your realm. Is that your experience? That if an organization is struggling with its sense of its own culture, have you seen evidence, or do you see evidence that people's meeting habits shift and change to enable them to deal with some of these bottlenecks or glitches in their underlying culture?
Definitely. One thing that for me it's important to note is if you want to improve the culture meeting of an organization, you need to start within the organization. So it's about improving certain meetings, because we talk about culture, but then there are the subcultures. Yep. So I think that where many companies fail is try to have a one-size-fits-all approach and improve all the meetings. So take Shopify, which I respect the organization in many aspects, but recently they decided to eliminate all recurring meetings. So while many people celebrated that, oh, what, this is brave, this efficiency, it feels like, well, it all depends. If we're meeting at the manufacturing, they don't have manufacturing, but let's say a company have manufacturing facilities, they need to meet every day to check, hey, are the machines working? So you cannot assume that every group of organizations should behave exactly the same. So I think it's better to start improving those agreements that Elise mentioned on a team or department basis, rather than to have a CEO said, hey, this is the way to go, boom, and we change everything overnight.
Yeah, I see you nodding vigorously there, Elise, and actually what that conjured in my mind is the idea that you use in Lucid very strongly, which is this idea of meeting flows or meeting streams. You know, that putting different streams of meetings with different purposes and different reasons for meeting, putting them together into a natural workflow, and then that can shift across different parts of the organization. Am I reading that correctly from your point of view, Elise?
Yeah, absolutely. And I find the Shopify example to be a fabulous train wreck of an example as well, because, you know, so there are basically 3 levels at which you can work on a meeting culture that's gone in a direction that you don't like, that's not working well or healthy for your organization. And that first level is the intervention level. And that's the level that your C-suite tends to operate at. They'll do things like have a meeting ban or a meeting free week, or say, hey, Freedom Fridays are very popular, right? No meetings on Friday. We're seeing the same kinds of intervention level things in the return to office conversation. Everybody has to be in the office 3 days a week, regardless of purpose. You know, so some of these things, and you look at that and you're like, okay, well, that's ineffective. It really needs to happen at the team level. It needs to be purpose driven. There needs to be a reason why we're doing these things. Mm-hmm. But at the C-suite level, they can't do those level of details, right? The Shopify C-suite is not going to go in and say which of those recurring meetings need to happen. So the intervention approach makes sense when you look at it from their perspective, but finding interventions that are guardrails, that are about stating clarity of intent, mm-hmm. And then giving it to the teams to do the implementation step. So that's intervention. Then the teams need to implement exactly what you said. Here are the meetings we need to run and why. Here are the ones where we're going to come together. Here's the ones where we can do this online. And hey, guess what? Half of them we don't need because we can do this by Slack or email in our system of truth, right? And then the final step, so intervention, C-suite, implementation, team, department, project level, iteration, right? Where are the feedback loops? Where are the learning loops? So that culture can get continuously closer and closer to the culture you aspire to have. Because these are not one and done things.
Oh, yeah. So I really like that idea of the 3 levels, because again, when you're speaking there, Elise, what's conjuring in my mind is this idea of difference, that mm-hmm. different groups, different levels within the organization need to do things in really different ways. But Gustavo, that sounds like that poses a challenge then for the organization culture. In how do you bring all those three levels together? And probably more importantly, how do you hold them together if they are very different from each other?
Yeah, I think that the way to hold everything together through iteration, I think that all the three steps are real critical. But in the end, at least in my experience, I don't know if Elise it goes through the thing, the iterative part is the most difficult, because that first of all, it's removing the perfectionist mindset that many leaders have, that they want to find this solution and move on, versus, hey, we don't know what's going to work for us, because once again, copying what other companies are doing, it's never the right way to go. You have to create your own practices and norms and rules and styles. But I think also the iterative part requires to understand that maybe when you start something, you have certain assumptions, but then reality proves you wrong, or maybe the context changes and you need to continue to adjust. And I think this is, for example, Elise talked about the return to the office. This is something that rather than iterate, people are pivoting from black to white without any clear reasons. So recently, the senior VP from Prime Video told people, hey, disagree and commit. We are going back to the office. I don't have any data to support this, but regardless, I know it works, so let's do it. So that kind of decisions are completely clueless. First, because the principle of disagree and commit that you can use in many meetings to make decisions about really giving people a space to share their input, which in this case, it didn't happen. And the commitment, it's about once the people have a fair conversation, not to force alignment or impose a decision. So I think that that's part of the idea, that leaders get very anxious, at least in my experience, because they want to be right, they want to be in control. So they jump going through the difficult journey of iterating, learning, being intentional, take their time, listen to different voices, especially when they're going to be completely opposite to what they think.
We're really stuck by the our preference for current results as opposed to long-term results, because it's vastly more efficient to have the teams do some work to figure out when they should be together and when they should not, and then gather that data and make a sensible, purpose-driven policy. Because you don't have to whipsaw things. You don't have to rehire all the people who just quit. It's just way more cost effective and way more performant to do a return to office strategy based on some input and some intelligence and some iteration. And yet you have to think about it for many more months, and it freaks people out, so they just don't.
But the point is, leaders sometimes make decisions on the exceptions, and this applies to rules. So basically, when something's broken, rather than fix that particular thing, they say, oh, because these people didn't respect a principle or whatever, we're going to change the rules for everyone. Today, I was talking to a client earlier on, and they've been working a very distributed way, and now they are realizing that they need people back to the office. For example, there are certain roles that at least 20% of their time, they need to be in the office, not because they want, but because they need to perform certain tasks that require taking care of equipment, so doing things in place. So what I was telling is that rather than trying to fly someone from the East Coast to the West Coast, which is not comfortable for the people, it's very expensive, why do you reassign that 20% of the responsibilities that role has into another role? So you free up that person and give them other responsibilities, so that role could operate 100% either hybrid or remote. So those are the things that I think people need to start thinking differently. The point is not how much time we spend where, it's about how we rethink the way we distribute and we organize work as well.
Right on. I had a conversation with a client that was similar, but on the other side. So they were looking to bring people back together because they are heavily in-person based, right? They do a lot of work with facilities, a lot of work with teams that need to perform their jobs in person. And they have support staff that work around them. So IT and HR and all of that. And IT and HR don't really need to necessarily be in the room. And they keep saying, hey, we don't need to come in to bond because we've seen that GitLab and Atlassian and all of these other companies can do a fabulous job without coming into space. Well, GitLab and Atlassian and all these other companies have years and years and years of having developed how they work and their systems, their Zapier, you know, all of their things where they've got single sources of truth documentation. They have clear meeting procedures, all of these things that this company did not have. So it really, when you're looking at the location first, you're looking at the wrong question, right? And very much like when you look at meetings as being about meetings or about being about calendar time or people's time in the room, you're looking at the wrong question, right? The question really needs to be, what is the function of what we do together collaboratively? And given what we have now, what's the best way to accomplish that? And if what we want to do is be mostly remote, what we want to do is to drive costs down or whatever, what needs to change in how we work and in how we are equipped for that to be possible?
So if I go back to our original framing question, you know, how to create a meeting positive culture, the common thread that I'm hearing actually from both of you is there's a requirement for adaptability, flexibility, but more importantly, it's adaptability and flexibility focused on the correct question. And is it fair to say that both of you are identifying that organizations very frequently focus on answering the wrong question when it comes to figuring out how they go about managing their meetings and conducting their meetings? Is that, am I interpreting correctly there?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. So here's an example. I've had this in my queue to respond to forever, and I don't know if I can send this to you in the chat, but Adam Grant recently put out a post on LinkedIn. And Adam Grant is a social psychologist. His most famous book is called Think Again, which is really about looking at a situation and coming at it from a different angle, rethinking, reframing, right? And he runs a podcast, a very famous podcast, and he's going to do an episode on his work-life podcast about meetings. And here's how he framed the input he wants. I hate meetings. I would love to hear from you. What's the worst meeting you've ever attended? And what's your favorite way to make meetings not suck? So what do you think? What kind of answers are we going to get? What's kind of interventions? What kind of strategies do you get from, I hate this. What's awful about it? Is there any way for us to make it not suck? You know, and you can see it thousands, like 3,000 comments or something on this thing. Yeah. And most of the comments are comments about things that were irrelevant to the person who had to be there. Right. So the status meetings where everybody tells status and there are 40 people and nobody gets to speak. So that's a fundamental lack of design and lack of basic training in meetings. Yeah. Most of the replies, though, are about terrible behavior from individual people. You know, the boss who walks in and berates people. Yeah. You know, the coworker who comes in and cries on the table. You know, the client who's 20 minutes late and then yells at everybody. Like those kinds of things are not the meeting, right? That's having to work with an unpleasant person. So when you're asking this question and you're equating those things and you try to solve the problem of the terrible boss or the terrible client or whatever by canceling all your recurring meetings.
Yeah, but maybe the trite answer, maybe the trite answer and provocative answer to that question would be, we'll just stop having meetings and then let's see where that takes them. Because a bit like, we'll cancel the recurring meetings, but let's go another step. Let's just cancel all meetings. Let's just do away with meetings. Now, what are we going to do? So then we're going to focus on what problem have we got? What's the best way to solve it? Who needs to be involved in solving it? How long do we need to take to solve it? Okay, sounds like we're starting to set up a meeting flow. So
Yeah,
maybe the
so
and I'm
teams
being,
try that. Like
and
Salesforce has done it several times. They've just canceled all their meetings for several weeks at a time. And people send a lot of email for a couple of weeks and then can't wait to get back in. So it does, as long as it's an intervention without also asking the positively framed question, right? If you only start with a negative frame, it's very hard to get to anything except for a negative answer. When you start with a negative belief, you get a negative result.
Could I ask the same question of both of you, but actually I'll try and ask the same question, but from really completely opposite directions. So Gustavo, from an organization culture point of view, if an organization has a problem with its culture of whatever description, to what extent does it start by working on its meetings to address that? And the flip question, which is largely the same question, Elise, from when you're asked for meetings interventions, is it really what they're asking you to intervene on is our organization culture? I hope I'm asking the same thing, but I'm asking it from two really different sides of, I hope, the same coin.
Yeah, I think that first of all, meetings, it's a nice way to quickly get to learn about a company culture. So basically the bad behaviors quickly show up the same as the good behaviors. Yeah. And I agree with Elise that, for example, someone interrupts other, or they're very disrespectful, or they are bullying each other, that's not a meeting problem, right? It's a leadership problem or a cultural problem. I agree that when you start with asking a negative questions about meeting, people are going to rant. I do something, we have a couple of sessions about meetings with different consultants that we walk them through the process. And of course, we ask the question, what was the worst meeting to get that? And then we say, look, meetings are not either bad or wrong. They're just a necessary part. The point is, because certain meetings are really badly designed or are unnecessary or they're unproductive, then don't kill meetings for the sake of it. I like what you said earlier, that meetings are part of a continuum that has to do with collaboration, with decision-making, with creating strong interpersonal relationships, with giving feedback. And we shouldn't take them as a single unit. They're part of both asynchronous and synchronous communication work together. So I think that when we see meetings like one part, we're going back to that Band-Aid, fixing the symptom, right? To understand, okay, how can we collaborate better? How can we communicate better? How can we give feedback better? How can we innovate and come up with better ideas? And then when do we need a meeting or not as part of that dynamic?
Yeah, Elise?
Yeah, the short answer to your question is yes. Anytime somebody comes looking for improvements in their meetings, they are actually looking for help solving something that's fundamentally not functioning in their culture. Okay. And they've identified the meetings as the #1 blocker to making progress. So usually, and frankly, lots of people don't really come for help with their meetings because they assume that, oh, we know what we're supposed to be doing. We just need to do it, right? We know we're supposed to stay on time and keep it relevant and have an agenda. We just need to do it. So we don't need anybody to come talk to us about that. I think they're probably more likely to actually look for the cultural fix. The meetings are a great intervention point.
And interestingly, and this point has been raised in some of our previous conversations, to our knowledge, or certainly to my knowledge, no undergrad and no postgrad programs offer any form of meaningful schooling or tuition in meetings, in either running them, being part of them, managing them, organizing them, scheduling them. We just don't do that, which is extraordinary given the amount of time and resource that we put into meetings. And then we get the question that the guy you referred to there posed, I hate them. what are we going to do about them? You kind of go, whoa, guys.
What can you expect?
It's Elise, I know I've spoken to you in the past about this concept, but when I was doing my own research on meetings, something struck me fairly profoundly, that meetings are the windows to the cultural soul of the organization. So if you want to see the organization in all its living glory, just look in the window of a few of its meetings, and you really quickly see what that culture is starting to look like and sound like. Would either of you or both of you have a comment on that?
I obviously think that's true, which is why I focus on meeting performance as my lens and intervention point.
Yeah.
Partially because that, right? You go into the meeting and you can say, I can see it. And when you talk about culture, we end up talking about words like, decision velocity and inclusion and safety and freedom and agile and all of these things, which are important and beautiful and huge and hard to put your fingers on. And when you get into the meeting, not only can you see culture, but you can do something about it, right?
Mm.
Like when I take 5 seconds at the beginning and we all take a deep breath and say, hey, it's really great to be here. I'm so glad to see you. Let's smile.
Mm.
That can shift a room. That is a very simple thing that I can do. Hey, how are we doing on a scale of 0 to 5, right? I'm doing a training series right now with the city here, and it's 60-minute trainings, dozens of them, all on Fist to 5. That's all we're doing. How do you check in with somebody? How are we doing? What's our confidence? That's it. That's it. And in that tiny, tiny, tiny practice that anybody can do, they're having all the conversations about, how do I deal with my boss who won't do this? How do I deal with the engineers who don't like to do anything that is not work related? Hey, can I do this with conservatives? Can I do this with women? Can I do this with a mayor? Like, yeah, it turns out they all can do this, but all of these questions about power and inclusivity and diversity and accessibility and all the big culture things. What does it mean if I disagree with somebody? Is that okay for me to do in a room? What if we don't all agree? How much time do we have to spend on it? Through a little tiny tangible thing that you can grab and you can do. That's powerful. So yes, you can see it, and yes, you can change it. And that's cool.
And meetings are where the organization comes together to communicate, to engage, to connect. And that's where that power base lies in the meeting. It's an intervention point. Is that a fair point to say? Yeah. Okay. Gustavo, from looking at it from the flip side, looking at it from the pure cultural side, and then saying, okay, are the meetings a fair window to the soul of the organization?
Definitely. For me, and the model I use, meetings are part of the culture. They're one of the elements. So it's not just about values and things that people usually spend a lot of time talking, but actually don't move the needle. I like that metaphor of the window of the soul. And one thing about our soul, neither of us has a white or black soul. We have lots of a kind of a spectrum of grace, if you wish. And I think one of the interesting things for me that I put a lot of attention to is how people manage conflict. How do they manage dissent? So I was intrigued about the positive term that we use for this particular gathering. And sometimes positive lately on has been more of a toxic positivity. So we all need to agree with each other. We all need to like each other and blah, blah, blah. One thing is respect for the individual, but other thing it's disagreeing with their ideas. And I think for me, it's important that many people feel that when there's conflict, when there's tension within a team, that's ineffective. And for me, it's on the contrary, more about facilitating conflict in a respectful and functional way for people to actually be able to present different viewpoints, to challenge each other, and then get to better outcomes. So there are many meetings that people qualify them as, oh, they're great because basically they look nice, people enjoy them, they were happy. But then when you look at the outcome, both from a team and solutions or whatever they were looking, decision perspective, they fail. So I think it's important to also address that element. And also, Elise talk about inclusivity, whatever. I think a lot of companies and teams I'm working with a couple of companies that they keep bringing up the idea we're weaponizing those elements, those positive elements. So people can do whatever. Well, what about being together? We're one single culture. So they're using the culture lingo to do whatever they want, but in the end, they're harming their relationships, they're harming the team, they're harming the work.
Yeah, wow.
That's amazing. And Martin, I'm conscious of the time.
Oh,
If I
yeah,
may step
absolutely.
in and take advantage of these two great guests that we have here. And it's I'm at awe listening to them speaking at each other sometimes without even you intervening, Martin.
Sure.
And it's amazing to see this expertise here on our show today. My question to you, though, it will be on something that I'm still surprised to see how little evidence management has in relation to meetings. And I'm talking about a dashboard that could tell you in advance that your regular meetings are failing. And so you will have a compelling reason to take a decision, right? But not like, I think that, let's do 3 days a week because I feel that's going to work. So how about your experience and your views on these tools that could help managers on having hard data, hard evidence on meeting performance and reasons to change anything on meetings?
I have a lot of strong opinions on this, and this could be a very, very long conversation. I think Gustavo and I both recently have been I've been doing a lot of training on using consent, not consensus, and other ways in which to do productive conflict, productive, right-sized conversations so that you can you can advance what you're doing. And I have to say, in regards to all of these dashboards, there is not a consensus or even consent on what it is we should be measuring. We don't have the disagree and commit to metrics that are meaningful at the cultural level that we're discussing. So the dashboards and the tools are really good at doing things like looking at flow time, the amount of time you spend in meetings versus other kinds of work, recovery, which is how much time you have between meetings to get one glass of water, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Right. They can look at whether you have an agenda, whether you have a purpose, did people show up, were you on time, all of that kind of stuff. And that's table stakes. Table stakes, not even from the gambling, I have enough to be in the game, but from the table manners kind of level. We're able to measure whether or not people can sit politely and do some basic hygiene things, which does not have a significant impact on these larger cultural questions of whether the conversation we're having is meaningful to our goals. When we invite people and include people and they participate, should they have been invited and included and participated? Is it relevant to them? Is it relevant to our work? Are we creative? Are we innovative? Are we honest? Are we in integrity? Are we profitable? All of these things are what meetings are meant to do. And the tools aren't there yet. When the tools become able to be tuned to what you're doing, and there are some that are. So if you look at Gong or some of the other tools that are tuned specifically to the sales conversation. My job is to make you buy something that we can measure, right? How fast do you do it? How many meetings do you need to be in before they invite the rest of your team to increase your chance of a win, right? When win is clear, then the tools are useful. And until companies learn how to make the win clear for the rest of their meetings, the tools are premature.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So the the focal point of the tools is really the determining factor whether the tools are useful or not. That's, yeah, okay.
In my opinion.
Gustavo?
I would add that building on that same stuff, I think that because it's easy to measure things, so the point is everything can be measured. That doesn't mean that everything should be measured. And I think that companies are abusing metrics because they're an easy way to cover problems and other parts of our body too. So basically we have numbers. First of all, they're measuring the wrong things. I agree with Elise, but also they're lumping in all the information together. So rather than try to identify what's happening in different groups, they bring all the information together. So it's the lowest common denominator. You don't really get to have a grasp on what's going on. Also, I think there's a lot of emphasis into the process, no? The how, as we're saying, how many people, how long do meetings versus focusing more on the why. Why do we need to meet? What are we trying to achieve? Why are we here? And what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve? And are we achieving it or not? And for every meeting that changes. I think that for me, I like to find simple metrics to get started. Not that I don't like the quantitative data, but I think that human behavior is the most quickest way to understand. So for example, making meetings optional. So if people don't show up, it's like if you're having a party and you invite people, it's your birthday, no one shows up. Well, maybe you don't have friends, you invited the wrong people, or maybe, there are many reasons. So with meetings, exactly the same. When people are not forced, if they really appreciate being there, they're going to show up. And if not, maybe either you need to cancel the meeting, you need to redesign it, you need to invite different people, but there's something wrong with that. And that for me is a nice symptom. How are people interested in showing up or not?
I love that
meetings
rule.
and experience. Also, how can you, if you don't make the meeting sexy enough for people to join, then it's upon you, not on people. So, and then the metrics are measuring what people are doing versus what the meeting organizer, the host, not the owner, because I hate the term meeting owner. It feels that the meeting's for one person rather from the guests. No, it's like if you do a party, don't do it for you, do it for your guests. The same applies to meetings.
So it actually sounds like that question, Paul, is sufficiently provocative that we could have an entire conversation just on that question of measuring meetings. Mm-hmm. And you could just leave it at that, just measuring meetings, ... because there's so much in what both of you have just said in the last 3 minutes. We can't continue that conversation, unfortunately. But Paul, we might just take note of it because I think Elise and Gustavo might just have fed us the next theme for our next conversation, because it's a fascinating topic. Mindful of our time, guys, we're approaching 50 minutes, believe it or not, and time has really flown on this one. I normally try to do a very quick summary, but what a rich conversation. It started with a question: how do we build a positive organization meeting positive organization culture? But actually what kicked us off was Gustavo wandering around in the outback, not sure where he was, and wondering about how the mountain lions might come and have him for breakfast. But in actual fact, that was really provocative thought, because that brought us into managing the unknown, dealing with the possibilities of the unknown. But then before you can do that well, you need to become comfortable with the unknown. And the idea then of culture constraining organization meetings because of our rigidity with the format, with the method, with the process, and the possibility then that we might just be losing sight of, but why are we meeting? Is the form of meeting that we're actually proposing to use best fit to meet the outcomes that we're actually trying to achieve? Extending that, we talked more then about the idea of organizations shifting towards more ad hoc type meetings. Elise, you touched on this point for us, and that can be a symptom, a clear enough symptom, that actually the current structured way that we have of managing and running our organizational meetings just may not be fit for purpose. So people spontaneously move to an ad hoc form in order to meet their real needs. And their real needs then might help to focus them in more productive use of their time, rather than sticking with staid or stale meeting procedures that just don't meet expectations or needs. Elise, you also then took us into the idea of the 3 levels in the organization. So the executive C-suite, the teams-based level, but then the concept of iterations. And Gustavo, you picked up on the importance and significance of that iteration piece, which then becomes a key driver of managing the organization's cultural shifts through its organizational meetings. I mentioned then the possibility that meetings can be seen as windows to the soul, to the cultural soul of the organization. Both of you agreed with that concept or that proposition. And I suppose where that took us in our conversation was then to say, actually, maybe when we're convening our meetings and maybe to become meeting positive, maybe we need to shift the focus of the questions that we're trying to address or trying to answer within any particular or given meeting, either a meeting individually or a flow of meetings that might happen within a team or a group or an organization. So shifting our focus to what question are we trying to answer might be a really significant point to building a meeting positive culture. Because by addressing that question, we have a significant chance of actually carrying out meetings in a way that meet people's needs. And Gustavo, you focused in our latter part of our conversation on focus on the outcomes, focus on what are we trying to achieve, and then matching how we go about conducting our business to actually deliver that outcome that we're actually looking for. A final point that I think both of you made in slightly different ways is that managing conflict and consent is actually a fundamental and a core part of what an organization needs to do and what meetings are used as a vehicle to do. But most importantly, a key takeaway that I'm getting from it is respect for the individuals can be fundamentally different to having differences of ideas or differences of opinion. And we can absolutely figure out how to manage our differences without ever compromising the fundamental respect that we show for every individual that's participating. I hope that summary has done some justice to a really, really interesting conversation. And thank you both very much for joining us on it.
That was an amazing summary. And before you go, Elise and Gustavo, perhaps we could have just a note for the viewers on LinkedIn. You know, they could be busy managers. They could be actually government officials, right? Because we mentioned the project, Elise, you're working with your CTO. But government officials, they might suffer for the lack of the desired meeting culture they would wish in the first place. What will be your piece of advice before we go?
I'd say look at your very next 5 meetings on your calendar and get clear on your purpose. Start small and iterate, right? How can I make each of these conversations a beautiful experience? Productive, rich, and that we're better for it when we come out the end. Start there and then call one of us, because we got all kinds of help to give.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good one. That's for the Miller. So that, I don't know what to add, but basically, I think that meetings are a social event that we human beings need. So we do it right, they're going to help us. So in that sense, invite people to provide input. So I would say, ask your team what are the things that are getting in the way for us to having better meetings. So don't talk about what meetings are bad, complaints. So what are the hurdles, the speed bumps, whatever there is that we need to take care of to start improving our meetings. So rather than look at perfect meetings, how could we increase maybe the meetings that we have by 15%? That will be that will create a huge impact.
Yeah.
And embrace the Salvador Dali quote, right? Have no fear of perfection. You'll never reach it.
Because you're not Dali.
Not happening. Not happening.
No,
So you might as well go for it.
Wow, this is a great way to end up this meeting, as we have a beautiful picture of everybody smiling here. And Martin, over to you, and thank you so much for the summary, Martin. But over to you to close this today.
Yeah, what a fantastic conversation, guys. It was really super to have you coming at this topic from mutually complementary but fundamentally different perspectives. But actually, I was really intrigued and really happy that we met in a really important place, I think. And perhaps that idea that meetings are windows to the soul, the cultural soul of the organization. Maybe if that's an overarching takeaway, we can either approach our meetings or approach our culture from either perspective, but actually we're going to end up in the same place at the end. Hopefully better organizations and better meetings.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Martin, I think we are reaching out our time. Our viewers will be eager to stay with us for another hour or so, but I'm sure we have plenty of stuff to do after this cup of coffee, watching us on LinkedIn or on our social media channels where we are showing this interesting conversation so far. So what have we learned about the art of hosting face-to-face meetings so far? And
yeah,
the wrap up on the program today.
What a whirlwind. Where would I start? We need to get AI to do the analysis, Paul.
There you go. That too.
let me have a crack at it. We started by suggesting, Kirsty, you pitched in first saying maybe we're out of practice with the face-to-face meetings. What we discovered was that the virtual meetings that we attended, particularly during the pandemic, probably gave all of us a degree of respite that allowed us to switch off cameras, switch off microphones, take a pause, step back, scream at the camera without anybody knowing that we were screaming. And we had to rehabituate ourselves back into face-to-face. But then we very quickly changed tack. We said, do we actually have face-to-face expertise in meetings. And that brought us onto a completely different track, and a really interesting track. So a couple of things that came out of that. We basically talked about meeting leadership, meeting management, and we used our own personal anecdotes and so on to explore the idea that just because you're the leader doesn't mean you have to be the chair. If you are going to be the chair, are we presupposing a particular type of meeting? And does that cover all possible types of meetings? And I think we pretty much agreed, well, actually, it does presuppose and we have to chair every meeting, but we have to manage our meetings. So that brought us into the whole area of preparation for meetings, pre-planning for meetings, the importance of setting the outcome before we ever get into the beginning of the meeting. So we explored that a little bit. Kirsty, you took us into the purpose, the outcome, the structure, and the time, POST, as a simple but really illuminating acronym for, if you answer those 4 key questions in preparation, there's a very, very good chance that you're going to have the right people, the right time, and you're going to have the right. We then talked a little bit about post-action reviews. We drifted into the military a little bit. We talked about aviation, which I brought in because that's my own personal professional background. We talked about evaluation apprehension as a possible reason why many organizations don't seem to reflect on their meetings. And we very briefly explored why that might be. And I suggested an idea that Edward de Bono actually came up with, which is the use of plus minus interesting as a really simple tool, a bit like POST in preparing for meetings. Well, maybe we can have a PMI at the meeting to evaluate in a safe way, but in a slightly self-critical way. Critical positive, critical negative, but equally critical, did anything interesting come up? We then segued, we did a major left turn, I think was the way you called it, Joe. And we started to talk about AI. And I'm certain we could be here for another 3 or 4 hours talking in the direction that we had started to go. But I leave it at that. I hope that's a reasonably faithful and quick summary of some of the key points that we managed about in a really interesting discussion.
Absolutely, Martin. Thank you so much for summarizing this. We'll compare now with our AI note taker and we'll judge. Everybody in this meeting will be able to judge that. So final word, golden nugget. Kirsty, Joe, what do you have to share with our viewers here on LinkedIn? Perhaps they will be looking for you guys as meeting doctors to help them on their meetings. Can I have a golden nugget from both of you to close these today?
I think Joe's taught me something about me, which is evaluation apprehension. So thank you, Joe. That was, you've named something for me. And I was like, oh yeah, I recognize that.
Yeah. And Kirsty, thank you for POST, because that was a great acronym that speaks it's very similar to the two questions I always tell people to ask themselves when they're about to schedule a meeting. One, does the meeting have a purpose? If you say yes, ask the second question, which is, does that meeting require collaboration? Or does that purpose require collaboration? If you say yes to both of those, proceed to schedule your meeting. If you say no to either one, stop it.
Yeah.
You probably don't need a meeting.
Love it.
Okay, guys, so this is about it. That I hope that you enjoyed the program with us today, and please stay with us, as next month we're going to expand on this conversation and bringing AI into the field. That's all for now, and thank you so much for watching. Welcome, everybody. It's good to be here on the show again. And we are on episode 6. Would AI make meetings obsolete? It's an exciting episode, this episode today, isn't it, Martin?
Yeah, it's a follow-on actually from our episode 5. So we found our way into that conversation, and then we thought, okay, this could be a really interesting topic to tease out in a little bit more detail with some of our former guests, actually. So all 3 of our guests, we've spoken with them previously on other topics. So Jim, Ilkan, and Karen, you've heard this question before, but you might indulge us again. Is there anything that you normally don't share very outwardly, but that you might be willing to share about yourself for our guests or for our visitors and our audience today?
Who wants to start?
On a personal note, I take it.
Whatever, absolutely.
Well, I actually just recently did my first hill walk. So in Scotland, that's a very big thing.
Yeah.
And now when I say hill walk, it's probably a very easy walk for most people in this land, but for me, not so easy. But I got very excited when I got to the top. I mean, when you see the pictures of where we had to get to, I thought, well, it did take a few hours, but it was, and my version of flat versus the Scottish version of flat are 2 wildly different things. But then our leader, she did say, I didn't say it was flat, I said it was easy. And I went, okay, same. But it's beautiful. The land is beautiful. So it was just so we got to this point, a cairn at the top of this, I think they call it a Gordon. So we have Munros, which are over a certain height, I think 3,000 something feet.
Yeah.
And a Gordon is 2,000 or something. I can't remember exactly. But anyway, we sort of got to this top there, and we had these 360-degree views of the Cairngorms and then all the way down to the car. It's just gorgeous.
And you were getting the weather for it as well.
We did. We had good weather, actually. It was a beautiful day. It started off, the morning was just how you want it, sort of cool, slightly overcast. And then on the way, so that was when we were going up, and then it turned and was beautiful weather on the way back down. It was lovely and sunny and blue. And so this is a new thing. So I've got a new app now. So I'm going to collect walks. Not going to say hikes just yet, but walks. So yeah,
I love these sharings. I want to know more about that app, Karen.
All trails, really cool. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah. So from my side, Karen's story about trying something new. I found in about the past year or so, I'm really attracted to classic soul music from the 60s and 70s, Marvin Gaye and then Temptations and things like that. And if I open up Spotify and, like, oh, I want to listen to something, I'm going right there and I'm discovering all this like great stuff that I never really got exposed to. I kind of grew up with like rock, Beatles and hard rock and classic rock. And then I studied jazz and classical and things. So I just found this whole like world of new music out there called soul.
Yeah, maybe I could share also something about the music. So beside of my job in software business, I've been working as a big band conductor for maybe 39 years already.
Oh, wow.
And the latest gig that I was conducting was not like traditional big band music, but our soloist was the #1 rap artist from Finland, and we made arrangements about his songs. And after the gig, several musicians said that this was the best gig ever. The audience was so much with us, and the artists who have been playing just with a small band or just recorded backgrounds had the full big band behind him. And after every song, he turned to the band and said, "Guys, this is so fucking cool."
Love it.
And then the band was so on fire, and it was like really nice.
Super. Oh, Jesus, I'd love to be involved in something like that.
I want to hear that. You got to send me that link. Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I wonder, can artificial intelligence replicate that one, Ilka, huh?
I think that the feeling is quite unique when you feel the band spirit and
You've got
the response from the audience. So that cannot be replicated by technology, I think.
Yeah, that's so. Our topic actually is around artificial intelligence, and the possibility that could artificial intelligence make meetings obsolete? That's our topical question. And it may not be that they could completely obliterate meetings, but could they make parts of meetings, functions in meetings, roles in meetings obsolete? And if they do, what are the implications of that for all of us?
May I start?
Shoot, absolutely.
Yeah. So one of my favorite ways of working for a couple of years have been that when we have a company monthly meeting, and there has been like from 80 to 100 people participating. And if you think about this size of the meeting, 1 hour meeting, you think that someone is talking and showing some slides and others are digging their nose or multitasking or doing something else, but not really curious about what is happening. And we have changed that and tried several methods. So one way is to have like totally asynchronous meeting where there's like recorded videos that every team is reporting to others, like 2-minute videos and a couple of slides, and then asynchronous dialogue about each of the topics. But once we are online, we have like probably tens of activations during the meeting, so that we are asking questions, we are involving others, and then once you have real-time AI analyzing, summarizing, picking up themes and emotions, then it feels like we can get so much things done, so much prioritized during 1 hour meeting that it's incredible. And when it's started beforehand, like preparations, orientations, and then once there's something interesting in the discussion, it naturally, like without facilitation, it continues until it like shuts down at some point. So like using AI for helping us to collaborate, so that it's not replacing, but it's connecting us. I really love this way of working.
And how does it feed back? Is it through a kind of a chat screen or a chat line that it's feeding back to the participants?
No, we are doing it differently. So the idea is that it's not like giving the final truth, or it's not trying to replace the human dialogue, but it's like supporting the human dialogue by, for example, there's real-time summary that is updated once it finds something new from the dialogue. And then you can choose from different algorithms which kind of algorithm you would like to use. And is it like based on comments or replies or both? Then it can find out that what are the main themes of the discussion, updating also in real time. And if you would like to join like a theme, so a thread of the discussion that is like categorized by AI, you can just click join, and then you will have the filtered dialogue, so that you can see what people are talking about this topic. Or if you like, quite often we have sentiment analysis, and if people have concerns, that is recognized, and then I click show concerns, and then I can see that what kind of concerns people have, and I can reply in a live meeting to those. And without support of AI, that would be totally impossible to like have a chat with 100 people all together.
Wow. Karen, Jim, reaction to that? That sounds really interesting.
Well, I mean, I guess I've seen it in action and use it maybe, with smaller groups. So I use those tools for similar reasons. But I'd like to sort of say, I still think most meetings should be eliminated anyway. There's got to be a better way. So for me, and I think what Ilka was saying, the way, you know, how do you have large scale conversation that is valuable? And I think this is where the tools and the AI that can synthesize that information in seconds is just so powerful. From I'm going to look at it now from a facilitator's perspective as well. So when you're, you know, in the good old days, if you facilitated a conversation like that, so let's take it into the room again, you know, to a physical room, and let's say you had 100 people in there and you had them all walking around with sticky notes and bits of paper and stuff all over the walls, and albeit it was a lot of fun, but the reality is, would we have, did we actually ever really get the full essence of all of that information that's in the room? Because it's almost impossible to take people's different styles of writing. You know, we don't want to insult anybody by saying, I didn't actually understand a word he said on that sticky note. You know, so we I think we put a lot of assumptions into that work, and then we make wild promises around taking all of those sticky notes and all of those bits of paper and trying to turn it into something which would take hours, days, if ever. And so I think the bringing AI into that conversation as a host of a meeting or a meeting of any type, really, I think it brings more truth. It brings more, it allows us to, so I think what Ilka said is really important. It's not replacing in the way that we're talking about it anyway. It's not replacing, it's not coming up with new ideas. However, so it's taking what is there in the room and really turning it into meaningful content. And it really is bringing it from everybody. So that's one use. There is another way we can use, like, let's say, do I use those 5-letter words? No, it's 5, 6, 7, 8 letters. That, you know, the other AI tools out there.
Yeah.
That you do go to and ask questions of and see what it comes back with. I think we can use that in meetings as well. Maybe in smaller meetings, I don't know, but I think there's a way of integrating us as humans in that meeting and introduce this technology, you know, ChatGPT or whatever you want to call it, right? By saying, okay, well, here's another intelligence in the room. How can we use it? So let's ask it a question, because it might help prompt us to come up with better conversation in the actual meeting with the humans.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, so that's, yeah, Ilka.
Yeah, one thought from last week when we were talking about generative AI and what is our approach as transformation professionals and facilitators towards it. And then I found myself saying that actually in our context, AI should help us to be generative.
Yes, and yes, which I think is kind of that way of using it, isn't it? It's not there to, it's all in the power of how we use it and train it, whatever. You can. I'm not one of the people that's scared of it. I think it's brilliant. I love generative AI. Yeah.
Jim,
so far.
If you've had,
I'm very much aligned with both Ilka and Karen, and just to react and respond to 2 points, one from each of them. I know the title of this session is "Will AI Replace Meetings?" and the focus was on AI, but my mind went right to meetings. I think Karen kind of suggested that, like, do we need
them in the first place?
Right. And you know, my view is that I believe, and maybe I need to do more historical research on this, but the metaphor of a meeting, I believe, came from physical office places, right? And the technology of the time was the office itself. I sat over here and I got up and I went over there for an hour, half an hour, and I had a meeting. And then when the pandemic hit, we all went home, and that's the technology changed from the office place to Zoom. And we said, wait a minute, maybe this meeting could have been an email, right? There's that funny cartoon. And we had to rethink what a meeting was. And the point I want to make is that our technology enables us to do different things, and we need to adapt to that. So I think we need to really adapt what a meeting is to the technology. And, you know, I just mentioned Zoom, but now AI, and what does AI allow us to do? The way that I like to phrase it is that, you know, to shift from the noun, a meeting, to the verb, to meet. And I think we need to think a lot more about meeting, which is, you know, collaborating, meeting of minds, meeting of ideas, which, guess what? It doesn't have to be done synchronously in that same hour slot. Because as we know, if you do that all day long, you have, you know, the online fatigue and all those kinds of things. But what that really brings up for me is a flipped metaphor. I don't know if you've heard of the flipped classroom before, right? You know, when I was in college 3 years ago, no, a little bit more than 3 years. You know, you used to go and listen to the professor and take notes, and then you went home and did your work. Well, guess what? With videos, I can watch the professor so that when I go to the classroom, I get the work done. I think we need to think about work in that way. So what Ilka said really resonated with me is that you can do a lot of the information sharing and getting up to speed together. You can do a lot of that asynchronously, and AI can help you do that, as well as Karen pointed out, you know, to unblock or to move things along. But the part of meeting, I think, for me, that's most interesting, and this goes to a point I think Karen was talking about, is what happens after the meeting. I have found in my own research that the biggest pain point that people have is follow-up, getting information to stick, getting actions to stick. And there's this phenomena that I've called meeting amnesia, right? Where, and you know, Karen, you described it perfectly, right? You're in the room and the energy's great and the sticky notes are all over the place. And there's this assumed promise that something is going to happen with that. And very often it fizzles out, it evaporates, and the energy certainly evaporates, but actually the content evaporates as well too, right? And then nothing happens. And I think you know, in this, okay, let's recontextualize, let's come up with a new metaphor for what a meeting is and shift to the verb to meet. And I think one spot that is really interesting for me is the follow-up. And you know, I believe on this call we're having AI summarize this for us, right? So that right there, just that is huge in terms of helping us reimagine what a meeting can be. So the technology, it's never a technology problem, it's always a human problem, but the technology changes the human problem. And I think we have to adapt. And yeah, maybe it is a good thing if AI replaces meetings, but I think it'll help us be more effective and maximize our together time.
That's interesting. So there's two add values identified. Ilka, from Ilka's point there, the add value, and Karen, you overlap that point. The add value is in handling very large numbers of people and getting this continuous updated summary of the content of what's evolving, which is notoriously difficult for any one individual to do, even with a relatively small group. But Jim, the second potential add value then is in that follow-up. So what happened, the notes, and not only, I'm not talking minutes now, I'm talking the essence. So Karen, your point there about the vibe, the atmosphere, the energy, and then to translate that into extracting out the key content. So is that the primary focus where we would see AI contributing rather than replacing? Is that where we're heading with the conversation?
Maybe. I think it's a yes and. I mean, that, you know, we think about AI right now as a place, you know, something I go to and I interact with AI, but I think AI is going to underlie a lot of our software technology. And if meetings are now mediated through software, I think AI is going to underlie the before, the during, and the after of a meeting and help us get started, help us keep going, and then help the momentum afterwards as well.
Ilka.
Yeah, I think people like to meet each other, but they don't like meetings. And so what is the difference? And I think that because we would like to meet each other, what we would like to do as a natural thing is that we would like to talk about things that are important for us. And what we are doing in meetings is creating agendas that are making us as machines that are just proceeding there's something that might not be meaningful at all. And so one of my former colleagues developed a method. I think there's a book in English as well about this. He started to talk about no agenda meetings, so that you have like empty space, 2 hours, and then you start by asking that, what should we talk about today? What is important for you?
Important to us, yeah.
Yeah, and then like listening to everyone, and then next question is that, okay, we heard everyone, which topic should we pick? Maybe we have time for 2 or 3. And then once you start discussion, the next question is that, how should we talk about this topic so that it's useful for all of us? And then you start the conversation. A lot of space, a lot of meaning, a lot of personal connections, something that you might remember rest of your life, and you hardly remember any meeting that is formal and structured and like part of the machine kind of organizational thinking.
That's really interesting. Yeah, Karen?
I was just thinking, you know, this group here, we're quite familiar now with technology, and we're quite, I'm going to say, forward thinking or appreciating of, you know, what's in front of us and what we can use. But of course, not everybody that we work with and all the groups that we may associate with are like that. So I think there's something in here that we do need to also consider everybody and what are their needs. And it's interesting, I'm part of something I did earlier today. I do some volunteer work for our national life-saving organization, Life Saving Lives at Sea organization, the RNLI. And, you know, we have these really, really traditional type of monthly meetings, and you can just see by the look of my face how exciting they are. You know, we get the agenda, which is 12 points long, and we go, right, apologies, welcome, Treasurer's report. I've just emailed it to nobody ever asks a question about the Treasurer's report, right? The whatever report, the whatever report. The only thing that's interesting when we get to other business and we can all go, all right, now we can talk. Oh, it's time to go. You know? So, but shifting people from that idea to an open meeting, which we're going to try next week, is we're going to have a no agenda meeting, right? What are we going to talk about? What do we want? We're here to talk about fundraising. We're not here to talk about an agenda, right? So let's talk about that. But for some people, that's going to be like, oh my God, there's no structure. I'm terrified, right? And then you add AI into that, and now we've got a whole holy mess, yeah? In someone's mind and heart, at least. Yeah.
So familiarity with, but there's 2 things there, Karen, I think that you're touching. One is familiarity with technology and the use of technology. And then 2 is familiarity with the form of the meeting.
Yes.
And they're 2 quite different things.
Yes.
But equally important in the context of what we're talking about. You know, whether AI will or won't make meetings obsolescent or in some way augment them to actually significantly improve them and improve the ultimate outcomes. So are they 2 fundamental issues that have to be grasped before the full benefits of AI can actually be realized?
I don't know if it's before. I think it's that's part of the transformation and the evolution we're going to see. I really do, as I mentioned in my previous comment, I really do. It feels to me like there's this kind of awakening, and I'll say that very intentionally, of how of interaction in a team or collaborating right now. And I think that's because the new possibilities of technology, the new context we've been thrust into, all remote and things like that. And we're just now learning what I call a new common sense, right? It was common sense before, again, I was mentioning from the office, I'd go from the office and I'd sit down and we'd sit around a table and there were rules of engagement. How did you get started? What did you do just, while you're walking in? How did you get started? How did you end that, right? And we shifted from, hey, did you get the memo and where's the meeting room, to, how do I get on Zoom and how do I unmute, right? And just talking about that, I just want to be even more microscopic here. I used to work for GoToMeeting, made by Citrix. It's a telecommunication platform. And when I got there in about 2012 or 2013, one of the big challenges we had was that people didn't realize they could talk through their computer, right? Because prior to that, right, the common sense was to dial into a phone bridge, right? And people were still doing that through our tool, which meant they entered in twice, once for the video, once for the audio, and then they'd get feedback. And just telling people that they can talk through their computer. And I think then, oh, okay, now with Skype, I can talk through my computer. And then it was the mute button, right? And one thing that I see during the pandemic is just and when I say we with like a capital we, the common sense of meeting is people know the mute now. We've learned that. And I think we're on a journey. I think the pandemic has created this awakening, and we're on this journey towards a new metaphor through all of this technology now, AI and all of it included. And we're 5 years out, maybe 10 years out before we have this new common sense around what it is, what a meeting is. And I would say the question should be, what does it mean to meet? Because that's very different than what a meeting is. Because I think the old metaphor of a meeting has to evolve and change.
And that's going back into Ilka's point about people like to meet, but people don't like meetings. And then the possibility. So here's a thought as the conversation is evolving. If AI is the listening ear on the wall, okay, and we don't structure the meetings at all, we just meet and we just talk about what we think is important, and then we use AI to actually extract the summary, extract the priority, analyze the emotion behind the speech, distill from that where we feel importance lies, and then create the inverted commas, the agenda or the feed forward, not into the minutes, but the feed forward into the feedback to the participants, which Jim is going back to a point you made much earlier to say, well, it all evaporated. Karen, you made the same point. The vibe, the sense, the content, it all happened on the day, but it just disappeared. Does AI offer us this potentially groundbreaking opportunity to transform how we meet? Jim or Ilka?
I think more radical things are in our thinking than in AI at the moment. So if we think about, let's say this meeting, I'm eager to speak all the time, and then I have to wait for 10-15 minutes, cross my fingers, forget what I was about to say, and so on. And I think everyone has the same feeling that there's airspace for just one person at a time. So how could we rethink the whole meeting thing? Like what we have been doing for 10-15 years is like, let's be quiet in a meeting for 5 minutes and everyone is typing in things that AI is analyzing. So you don't have to wait for your turn. And if you have to wait for your turn, the quality of the dialogue is not a dialogue at all. It's like a series of monologues, because if you cross your fingers 10 minutes ago, you are going to say something that is not more relevant at the moment. And now we are used to that. It's quite natural for Finns, but for other cultures, it might be weird to be in an online meeting quiet for 5-10 minutes. But it's so powerful, and then there's a lot of things that can be a natural way for the continuity of the dialogue. So you cannot read it all during the meeting. You can see analysis by AI, but you have a reason to come back so that it connects to your daily work. And now we are testing like even more weird thing that is like we can all talk at the same time. So we mute our microphones, we talk to house space, it's transcribed in real time, transcription is analyzed by AI, so we can all talk simultaneously, even 100 people. And let's see how that will change the world. And the last thing I would like to say is that traditionally when you think about a workshop or a meeting, you think about the storyline, that you start, then you speed up, and then you slow down and close the thing. it's not no miracle that nothing happens after that because you closed it.
Right.
But what I think is that if you like to have like continuous flow, you need to like speed, and then when you are at the highest point, then stop, and then agree that how are we continuing this all this energy. And if you're using technology during the meeting, a familiar place that where you did all the job, you can go back there and it looks the same. If you are like documenting the post-it notes to PowerPoint, it's not the same. It's like wrong context. There's no personal connection to it anymore.
Actually, the only piece of paper I have on my desk is just one sheet of paper so that I can keep track of some thoughts and to-dos. Otherwise, I'm completely digital. But I actually have a term for that. And I agree it's broader than just AI. It's parallel processing. And I think one of the things why people don't like meetings, particularly all online meetings, is because this robbing you of your time, this one by one, there's a funnel, there's a very, very tight funnel of all of the energy and the information and ideas that we have in our head goes through one at a time, right? And what if you can parallel process? That is, what if we can all talk at the same time? The reason why this is very interesting for me, you know, I work here at Mural, a visual online whiteboard. And what I find is when you add that to a meeting, right? So if we had this meeting going in a Canvas at the same time, I would literally have been typing this, and you could have seen what I wrote down here, Karen, and everybody else, right? As we're going. So it's not just AI. I totally agree with you, Ilka, that this parallel processing, it's a new metaphor. That's what I was saying. We have to rethink what the metaphor of a meeting is. And it's not this one by one, right? Because it's so inefficient. If you have a meeting with 10 people and only one person is talking, think about that costing your company, you know, when all this energy and ideas and things. And I think so AI is one of the technologies, and I think that will unlock a lot of potential of teams, that we're gonna literally unleash all of this genius that never gets a chance to speak, or that gets forgotten or evaporated.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things with what, you know, Ilka's tool is that it kind of allows us to do that already. Yep. And so does yours, actually, just in different formats, right? So, and I'm quite a lover of both, so there you go. Anyway, two of my favorite tools that come out of that last 3 years. So what I was thinking is that, you know, everybody's getting busier as well. So this concept of meeting and being in a meeting now, so I'm now talking about in a meeting. And you're right, you know, what you guys are saying is that that's not having a gathering, that's not communication, actually. You know, it's a bit transactional. And I think this is where the meeting has to no longer be transactional. It has to be a place to meet with purpose. But, you know, and I see it even, you know, I run training and, you know, cohort-based training. And, you know, that big thing is, how do we keep that conversation? How do we start the conversation beforehand? How do we move it afterwards? See, I'm well trained, Ilka. And how do we keep it going afterwards, right? And, you know, and I think all of these tools allow this if it's facilitated well. So now coming to our facilitation world again, and we all have that ability to do that. You know, if we have a shared agreement around how we're going to do things, it's also, I think, what the power of these tools allow us to do is to give as you were saying, give everyone a voice. And it doesn't have to be here. It can be here. Not everybody processes at the same rate or the same time. It doesn't make any one individual less or more. We are just individuals. We're different. And so these tools, I think, allow us more flexibility, more inclusive, much more diversity of thought as well. So it allows for all of these humannesses to actually come together in a better way. So if these tools should help us to be better at being human, actually, as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can I introduce a fly into the ointment here?
How big is it?
AI to do its thing. it has to listen.
Mm.
And to do the scope of the things that you're all talking about, or that we're all talking about, it has to record. Now, in recording the content of people's meetings, that's when it potentially becomes sensitive. And secondly, preserving recordings of meetings and then the future custody of them, the future use of them. So any thoughts on that, and how that whole security, privacy thing, potential misuse of recorded material, any thoughts on that aspect of
it's a concern. It's a concern that I have for a couple of reasons. One is, if I just think about, in a commercial setting like Miro, our customers and, large banks or consultancies, you're talking about a merger and an acquisition or something like that. Is, well, guess what? You don't want something else listening in that is then going to be recorded necessarily, right? And I've worked with several companies where, at least at the moment, ChatGPT is just blocked, right, because of security concerns. So there are businesses and industries, regulated industries, where that's just from right out of the gate, that is a concern. I think there's also a concern that just as an employee, imagine, we've seen this already. If there's a legal situation and then all of the emails that you've ever written or all of your Slack chats are now up for discovery in a court case, right? And now we're talking about even more of if you're human, Karen, right? Even more of you is out there. Could that be used against you in the future? I think that's a concern, and I bet the laws haven't even caught up yet to that.
Well,
that
that's
type
the
of
whole
thing.
point of the letter.
So yeah, we all of these things that we said up until this point. Thanks for the fly, Martin, here. But all the things we said up to this point are exciting for us, right, as well too. But we also have to approach it with a very careful eye around privacy and confidentiality, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we have to be careful to not be too much of our human selves.
There you go.
The dark side of human.
I could share a story that is from a different angle, so not about legal issues or regulations and so on, but how we use the data that we collect. I started my career as a primary school teacher, and there was quite a young principal, a really great guy, and then an older colleague, and that older guy didn't like the principal, so in every meeting he made notes, really decent notes, and then it could be like after 8 years of principal saying something in a new meeting, this guy went back to his notes. Hey, 8 years ago you said something totally opposite, so can you decide that what is your opinion?
Like you're not entitled to change your mind or change.
Yeah, every 8th year.
It just made me realize that that's also very one-sided, right? So if one person's writing something and the other person isn't, then it's one word against the other. Whereas if it's recorded and you're both in the same space, maybe that's actually a protection. That's another way to look at it.
Part of my reason for asking this question is when I in a prior life, I was a professional pilot. So I'm kind of steeped in the whole background, the technical background of aviation. And one of the key safety features in an aircraft is the cockpit voice recorder and the aircraft data recorder. And all of you are familiar with those, the black box and everything. But when they were being brought in, so let's wind back to kind of 40, 45, maybe 50 years ago, when they were being brought in, major concerns were raised by the pilot community about, but hang on, this is my office. This is where I go to work for 6 or 8 hours. It's absolutely closed. It's personal. And now you want to record it. You want to keep it. And in the event there's an accident, you now want to extract it. How do I know you're not going to extract the information when there's no accident? So a whole body of actual legislation, international legislation built up around how that preserved data in a very specific context could be used or not used, as the case may be. And I'm just wondering, does that provide some kind of a signpost for where the ubiquity of AI might just need to have some kind of a protective legislative framework around it to say that the reason for using data cannot stray outside certain parameters? Otherwise, we really kill the possibility of people genuinely sharing their real thoughts. Would you have any reaction or response to that, or would that become just too claustrophobic and just kill the whole benefits of AI in the first place?
I mean, I think that's what I was suggesting when I said, the legislation hasn't come up. It doesn't necessarily need to be legislation. I think there could also be policies, like company policies, and there are already company policies like chat versus email. Who owns that, right?
Yeah.
And I think employees know now, I know my company owns all of my company emails. In the end, they're not looking at them in the moment, but once I leave, or if there is a court case or something that needs to be investigated, I realize that my company email is different than my personal email in terms of who owns that content. So I think there needs to be some wrapper around it, right? Because Karen, as Martin was talking, I was thinking, we need to be more human, and I think what I now imagine is you get into a meeting that's AI driven and nobody's talking because they're afraid to put anything on record. The opposite happens. So we have to be careful of that too.
We do. And I mean, who here is not on Facebook or something similar?
Oh, not. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm on it. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Most of us are on it or something similar. We pay taxes, presumably. So in reality, I mean, they can do what they want with our phone conversations already. They can already do whatever they want with Facebook. I don't care what anybody says, right? I'm praying that my WhatsApp calls are still encrypted, but I believe they are. But, for how long, who knows? So, if I think of, 20, 30 years ago, what we're talking about today would have been just ridiculous because of privacy and this, that, or the perception of privacy, which is being eroded every day. Now, that's not to say that I know very little about this, other than listening to some really very clever people on this subject. I spend every day watching at least one YouTube, they probably need to, I like the word policy versus another legislative thing, because I just think that's dangerous as well. Yeah.
And I think here AI makes a difference. So if you think about recording of the meetings, who watches the recorded meetings? No one. You never go back to them. No. But when it's transcribed by AI and you can search for anything, then it becomes like dangerous, or you need to be really careful how the data is utilized.
Yeah, can I answer that then, Paul? If I go back to Ilka, a point that you made, a little while ago, that we could have 60 or 70 people with the microphones muted. But then you might say, well, why do we need a microphone and a screen at all? Why not just, here's a topic, put the topic out to people, just record your thoughts, push them into AI, get the analysis, get the output, and forget the meeting. We don't need a meeting.
That's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, Jim, does that take us to where?
No, I don't see that happening. Actually, I think it'll take away the administrative parts of it, the transactional parts of it. But I totally agree with Ilka, and then Karen, I think you would agree too. We like to meet because there's a human element of even work, right? There's this idea of, well, this is work over here and life over here, or work and play or not. No, you know what? I have relationships at work. They're a different type of relationship. It's not my family relationship or friends, although those domains even overlap. I actually did a little bit of research on this topic of work friends. How many people have somebody that they worked with that they consider a friend, and maybe even after you left your job, you stay in contact with that person because you know what? I've asked people that, Karen, and everybody says in their career they've had somebody they consider a friend at work. We like to meet. Ilka said it. We like to meet, and we like to meet because we're human beings, right? So I think AI will make that more central by taking all the administrative work away from us. But if we never met, what is a job? What is a team? What is a company then if we never meet, right?
2 things came to mind. One is our school friends. Is that not our first place of work or whatever we want to call it? All right. For some of us, yes, some of us no. But but those people, that's where we made friends there. I mean, we always need to be somewhere to make those friends. We don't meet them in the bar, really. All right. Some people may, but for the most part, no. We meet them in our places of continuous engagement, if you like. And the second thing, or before that, was I'm thinking I have my colleague Nuala and I mean, we work miles apart, and we often just sit here working, but with the screens on. So we have Zoom on. We're not talking. But it's that moment of, as I was doing this, what do you think about this? It's that incidental moments that you can still create. It's not quite the same, but you can create it here if you have good intention, So I think that's still why, even though you could all be sitting there typing stuff away, which is important to capture, but for those, I just want to run this idea past you, and without having to say, have you got 5 minutes to yada, 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 get onto Zoom or whatever it is, you're just there. And there's some power in that.
Which is the equivalent of having somebody sat at the desk next to you. They just happen to be 500 miles away, but
through a screen, and it works. Nothing beats being in the same room.
Yeah.
This theme is so inspiring that it brings a lot of ideas in my mind. So one thing that we have been trying to figure out is that can AI learn to be a great facilitator? And what would that look like?
Wow, what would
so and one thing when we are recording could be that it's truly analyzing that what is happening in the room. We like a long time ago, we used a method from Losada that is about what kind of speech we have in the meeting. So is it positive, negative? Is it about us or others? And it is like, how do you say it? Is it like statement or is it like open question? And something that came out of the data that was really surprising, and you cannot feel it, you cannot recognize it in the meeting, was that, once you are in a meeting and one person is speaking at a time, you are waiting for your turn to say something. What is the basic of great dialogue are open-ended questions. But who makes those good questions in a meeting when you are waiting for your turn? But from the data, we realized that whenever someone is making open-ended question in a meeting, 2 or 3 minutes later, there's a huge amount of positive communication that makes a difference. But there's this gap, and you cannot recognize it without the data. But that was really, really surprising.
And that gap, I presume, is while the human is processing the question, making the associations, the connections, formulating the response, and then is that what it's accounting for, that gap, Ilka?
Yeah, I think there might be still someone waiting for their turn.
Okay.
So the question is like open in the air, and then it might turn, or then it's like the energy is coming in slightly.
Waves.
Our neurons start working together and in sync, you know.
Yeah.
So we bring in the emotions and the neuroscience and all of that, then there's all sorts of other lovely things going on here. But,
Yeah. So if AI, beside of recording stuff, could make interventions that, hey guys, now there could be a place for a great question. Who would like to do it?
That's amazing. Martin,
and that's when all the
mindful of
humans go
time.
quiet. Sorry, Paul. Yeah, go on.
Mindful of time, we need to wrap up.
Yeah, wow.
Friends and colleagues, it's been a wonderful conversation so far, but our viewers have other things to do, I'm sure, here on LinkedIn and Facebook and YouTube, where we will be live today.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation, because I think at the end of the conversation, it's certainly in my mind, it's left me with a massive amount more things that you would now want to explore, delve into, consider, than certainly what I had in my mind when we started the conversation. Ilke, you started with the concept of real-time analysis by AI, and that analysis could be done thematically, through summaries, through filtering, through identifying concerns, and so on. We talked then about the possibility of AI being able to support the engagement of significantly bigger numbers, 50, 80, 100, 150 people, where it can keep track of considerably more data than the normal human participant or facilitator. I suppose what that leads to, and Jim, I think you picked this one up, was the idea that maybe our whole concept of what it means to meet needs to shift. But that would have to be qualified by a point that Karen and Ilke made, which is that while we may not like meetings, as humans, we absolutely not only like to meet, I think, but we need to meet. That's part of the human condition. Jim, you raised the point that if we don't meet, how do we have community? How do we have organizations? How do we have groups? How do we have teams? So the picture emerging from our conversation is that AI has this possibility to act as a fly on the wall. I think I introduced the phrase fly on the wall. It has that possibility not to take over the meeting, but actually to add to the meeting something that we humans actually can't add to the meeting. We can't step back from the totality of the conversation that's taking place. We can't analyze that totality in real time. AI can do that. And then it can feed back into the conversation. And Ilke, your point just towards the end of our discussion was maybe it can feed back in with a judicious question, with a thought-provoking question, with a summarizing question that can help to bring focus back, not to where AI decides the focus should be, but where AI has analyzed our content and said, here's the breakdown, here's the weighting, here's the emotion, and when we put it together algorithmically, here's the conclusion that you guys are reaching, not that AI is reaching. But that then brings us to, I suppose, I raised the point about security and the concept of, if we're all being recorded, if that recording is being retained, and the purpose or role to which that recording is put in the short future or even in the long future, do we end up needing to protect and preserve that through some form of legislative framework? Jim, you raised the point that, well, perhaps organization norms, culture, standing operating procedures, guidelines, perhaps they can help us here. But it also begs the question that if people use AI output nefariously, then does it expose people to the point where they stop contributing themselves or of themselves out of concern that they may be misrepresented at a later date because that recording is there. And Ilke, you made the point that transcripts of the recordings are even more risky because they're now searchable. And so there's a big question there that we've touched on, but we haven't explored or we haven't bottomed it out. The overall conclusion that I'm drawing from our conversation so far is actually AI won't make meetings obsolete because we're humans, we're going to continue meeting. However, AI has a very strong possibility of completely transforming what we mean by meetings. And we all might just need to go back to the drawing board to say, well, what do we want meetings to be in light of the fact that we have this ear fly on the wall who can do so much more that we can't? And then we can ask ourselves, okay, how might we change our meetings in order to make maximum use of this all listening fly on the wall?
Absolutely, Martin. Thank you so much for the summary and golden nugget from our dear guest speakers and on any particular order.
I just wanted to, my mind just kind of went back to the question of, so then what is the human part of it? And I always end up at imagination. And I think, part of us being human is our imagination, which is even different than creativity in my mind. So if we can get the administration and the transactional parts done, we can be more imaginative. So I don't think it'll replace gatherings and meetings, as you mentioned, Martin. I think it'll allow us to be more imaginative together as a team.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim.
I think just be curious and see how many people you can get to be curious together, to see, and not to be afraid, because I think there's a lot of fear out there at the moment as well with all of this. And don't be afraid of it. We do have influence over all of this as individuals. So if we use these tools in a positive, imaginative, creative way, then that can be a good thing. That can really enhance life, actually, as we know it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karin. And last but not least, the person who actually innovate the industry to introduce AI in meetings takes the last word in our AI meetings episode. That's fine. Ilkka.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm always thinking that language is important. And when we have a word meeting that has a lot of history, and what if we would like to start from the scratch and think that we would like to meet each other, and how could we call it to make a difference? Or, there's conferences and unconferences. So what unmeetings would look like?
I love it.
Great. I mean, we couldn't have a better end of the program. And thank you so much, dear guest speakers, Jim Kalbach from Mural, Ilkka Mäkitalo, it's Ausspace founder, and Karin Overy, one of the most Ausspace facilitator experts I know. Thank you so much for joining, Karin. And of course, to my dear co-host, Martin Duffy, always doing these amazing summaries and keeping track of the conversation. And it was really, really great to have this conversation. And we'll see each other soon, I hope.
Yeah. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, folks.
Thanks.
one of these discussion topics that we could fill a day if we had a day. We've run out of time. I think it feels like it's probably been one of the quickest conversations we've had in our fireside chats. I normally try to do a kind of a 1 minute or a minute and a half very quick summary to catch some of the key points. So I might try that if I may. We started just discussing the idea of happiness versus wellness. And I think we broadly concluded they're two sides of the same coin. They go hand in glove. But that brought us into asking about the idea of happiness comes from relative thinking. So if you have a point of comparison, then your assessment of your own happiness may fundamentally change and fundamentally alter. I suppose that makes it a requirement then to look as much inward as outward, because if you only exclusively look outward for comparison, you may miss a whole lot of internal reasons to be or to feel happy. And Isabella, I think you made that particular point, but you also made the point at the same time that it's an evolutionary thing. It's a life cycle thing, that we don't necessarily come to that conclusion until we've been around a couple of blocks of happiness and perhaps unhappiness before we discover that we need to look equally inside as outside to arrive at our own sense of that wellness. That brought us into a discussion about culture, which brought us to and then we moved into an organization focused culture. Paolo, you made two really interesting points about how we measure this. And you referred to the USA Organization of Psychology from 2000 that started looking at the individual measurement. And then 2010, the HBR articles that now started to look at the organizational value, economic value that can be put on wellness or well-being. That's brought us into the area of, so at national level, how might we go about measuring it? And Obi, you made reference to Bhutan's, where they have a number of key metrics. They've got 4 pillars, they've got 9 themes on which they actually try to make that measurement. I do know just from personal background reading and stuff, New Zealand has something similar. I'm just not familiar with the detail of that. That, I suppose, then brings us into, so at a national level of well-being, what can governments actually do? And Paul, you posed the question provocatively to us and absolutely bang on to say the unhappiness drivers. What might those unhappiness drivers be? And how do we avoid them? How do we stay away from them? 2 points arose there, is this sense of security. And the second thing was closeness to nature. And the final word, Paolo, I'm leaving it to your good self, in the concept of sharing gratitude. If we were to identify one thing that actually promotes happiness stroke well-being in both the giver and the receiver, it's expression, direct, overt expression and sincere expression of gratitude. And maybe that's something when we step back and look at our current society ills, maybe if we expressed a bit more gratitude and maybe a bit less expectation or belief in entitlement, maybe the wellness quotient or the happiness quotient might increase substantially. I'll leave it at that, Paul, if you wanted to round. Yeah, I'll have to keep this one very short, Paul. Thank you both for some really interesting and provocative ideas. I suppose key point that we started with was culture operates nationally, organizationally, and even there are multiple subcultures. Well-being tricky to define, difficult to track, very personal. It's personal to individuals. It's then personal to organizations. So challenging to make a correlation. So that would be my overall sense. Couple of things that I think came out of it. The whole question of the impact of national culture on organizational cultures, the timeline over which they might happen, where the shifts might be changing, have to be taken into account. We have all had an aberration, which was the pandemic, that took 2 years to more or less see us through it, making it even more challenging to make an assessment or a firm grounding of the impact of our culture on well-being. But I'd summarize it in the very last point, Anthony, that you made, which I think is, one, it's an optimistic point, but it's the whole question of the impact of social media on our organizations. My analogy of the garden hose from 15 or 20 years ago to the multiple fire hoses of today, which is largely due to social media. But perhaps we are at the very bottom of that well-being curve, with the possibility to increase positively on well-being. But it's likely to need a shift, which you identified, Anthony, of does social media itself now need to change because of AI, because of the lack of clarity as to whose voice are we hearing? Is that likely to drive people back into individual personal connections? And from that, we would hope that personal well-being and collective well-being would start to actually have an upward trajectory into the coming years. But we very quickly moved on to the idea that we need to change the language. It's not about meeting because it conjures up too much preconceived ideas. So that you then took us, Ilke, again, you took us into the idea of transcripts and exploration of transcripts and the use of AI to analyze transcripts, summarize transcripts, and then create dynamic links back into the transcript if the summaries don't fully make sense to us. And that's all really valuable material. But this need to shift our thinking on the concept of meeting, and that conjured up the idea of a before, a during, and an after. Central to all of that is this idea that as human beings, we want to get together. But sometimes a big challenge that we have is trying to decipher all of the inputs that are taking place during our get-togethers. So where AI may become a real partner is in the preparation piece, as Ilke identified early on, where it could help us prepare agendas. In the meeting piece, where it can help us to dynamically either create visuals. Karen, you made that point, and there's a real visual out of that, the idea of mind maps and dynamically representing the conversation as it's happening. And then there's the idea of doing summaries after the event with links back into the transcripts to bring us into the full flow if that was necessary. Ilke, can I link that back to the visual that you gave us of conversation, the organization conversation being a river? I called it a river of discourse in my own meeting research, and that islands or meetings are islands within that conversation flow or that river of discourse within organizations. All of that was leading us to say, so what is the precise role that AI can fulfill in the context of getting together for whatever purpose? But that equally brought us into the area of, and I'll pick a number of words that we used. We talked about exploration, creativity, analysis, imagination, emotion. And I won't say we concluded, but I think we explored the idea that, well, AI isn't emotional. It doesn't have emotion. It gives us bland summary, but it doesn't infuse our engagements with passion, with commitment, with diversity, imagination, and stuff. So perhaps our biggest challenge with using AI in pursuit of supporting our get-togethers is to first define what it's meant to do to augment our natural and inherent human need, which is to get together and be emotional, be explorative, be inquisitive, all of the things that AI doesn't seem to be particularly good at. And we just need to figure out, before we go too far forward with AI, to say, what is it good at, and keep it doing what it's good at, and don't let it try and replace the bit that people are not only good at, we are the only ones capable of being emotional, sensitive, explorative, and so on. And maybe out of this conversation, we might not have redefined what our meetings should be, but maybe we've just put a mark on the ground to say, well, let's not engage AI too much more until we very clearly decide what is the boundary for it? How can it add value, rather than being in awe of what it can do that we can't do? But let's not forget what we can do that it can't do.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I do, except for that I don't know if we should. I think the way you framed it was first figure it out and then start using. I actually think on that. No, a lot of the things that we were talking about, I don't know what it's going to be like in years, what a meeting will be. Suggesting, and I really liked your point about mindset. I think it's the mindset that you bring to it and the intentionality. I think it's if you without knowing how it's going to help, as you're doing that.
Absolutely. There's a final tradition that we have in hosting our fireside chats, and I normally try to do literally a 1 minute or a 1.5 minute review or summary of some of the key points that we've discussed. So if I may, I suppose we started our conversation really talking about how much engagement the coach has, and I perhaps mistakenly framed it in terms of speaking. And I think the three of you concurred that if a coach is speaking more than about 10%, it might be a little bit too much. But actually, Stefania, you said that in some instances, a little bit more initially might be necessary in order to build and establish that foundation and that relationship. But I think all of you also concurred that a key part of the coach's job is to be present. And Steve, I think you made the point that being present doesn't require you to speak, that actually being present is optimally achieved when you're not saying anything. So it's building that empathetic relationship through listening seems to be a key competence of the coach and of the coaching relationship. The 10% of time that you would end up speaking seems to be more focused on asking key questions to get to the bottom of what the coaching relationship is intended to be about. And Stefania, I think you made the point tellingly later in our conversation that being clear on what the purpose of the coaching relationship is of paramount importance, because having that clarity then helps to maximally inform the nature and the content of the questions that are going to be asked. So again, coaching is not something that has this preordained long list of typical questions. It's more about the skill and the aptitude of the coach to be able to build that empathy through listening with their coachee. Steve, I think you introduced us to your personal core belief around our purpose in life and the idea of growth and the idea of love, and that both of those can be fused together through the coach's, I suppose, use of the coaching relationship to show that form of love. It's a platonic love, but it's a love for the underlying individual. And then through that, to enable the growth, which is one of the overriding purposes. That kind of brought us into the international dimension, where I put the question to you that from your experience, do national cultures have an impact on the coaching relationship? And probably the single biggest takeaway for me is that the three of you seem to concur that actually, when you strip away all of the national boundaries, national cultures, national histories, we are all people first and foremost. And at our core, it doesn't matter where we've come from. It actually matters that we are people, and that connection through the coaching relationship actually establishes fairly quickly and can transcend national backgrounds and national histories fairly rapidly. So I hope that has done some justice to a really interesting and in-depth exploration of coaching. Fad, fiction, or the future? My vote says, actually, I think it has a pretty good future, certainly in your three very capable hands. Because I think at the end of the conversation, it's certainly in my mind, it's left me with a massive amount more things that you would now want to explore, delve into, consider than certainly what I had in my mind when we started the conversation. Ilke, you started with the concept of real-time analysis by AI, and that analysis could be done thematically, through summaries, through filtering, through identifying concerns, and so on. We talked then about the possibility of AI being able to support the engagement of significantly bigger numbers, 50, 80, 100, 150 people, where it can keep track of considerably more data than the normal human participant or facilitator. I suppose what that leads to, and Jim, I think you picked this one up, was the idea that maybe our whole concept of what it means to meet needs to shift. But that would have to be qualified by a point that Karen and Ilke made, which is that while we may not like meetings, as humans, we absolutely not only like to meet, I think, but we need to meet. That's part of the human condition. Jim, you raised the point that if we don't meet, how do we have community? How do we have organizations? How do we have groups? How do we have teams? So the picture emerging from our conversation is that AI has this possibility
to act as a fly on the wall. I think I introduced the phrase fly on the wall. It has that possibility not to take over the meeting, but actually to add to the meeting something that we humans actually can't add to the meeting. We can't step back from the totality of the conversation that's taking place. We can't analyze that totality in real time. AI can do that. And then it can feed back into the conversation. And Ilke, your point just towards the end of our discussion was maybe it can feed back in with a judicious question, with a thought-provoking question, with a summarizing question that can help to bring focus back, not to where AI decides the focus should be, but where AI has analyzed our content and said, here's the breakdown, here's the weighting, here's the emotion, and when we put it together algorithmically, here's the conclusion that you guys are reaching, not that AI is reaching. But that then brings us to, I suppose, I raised the point about security and the concept of if we're all being recorded, if that recording is being retained, and the purpose or role to which that recording is put in the short future or even in the long future, do we end up needing to protect and preserve that through some form of legislative framework? Jim, you raised the point that, well, perhaps organization norms, culture, standing operating procedures, guidelines, perhaps they can help us here. But it also begs the question that if people use AI output nefariously, then does it expose people to the point where they stop contributing themselves or of themselves out of concern that they may be misrepresented at a later date because that recording is there? And Ilke, you made the point that transcripts of the recordings are even more risky because they're now searchable. And so there's a big question there that we've touched on, but we haven't explored or we haven't bottomed it out. The overall conclusion that I'm drawing from our conversation so far is actually AI won't make meetings obsolete because we're humans, we're going to continue meeting. However, AI has a very strong possibility of completely transforming what we mean by meetings. And we all might just need to go back to the drawing board to say, well, what do we want meetings to be in light of the fact that we have this ear fly on the wall who can do so much more that we can't? And then we can ask ourselves, okay, how might we change our meetings in order to make maximum use of this all listening fly on the wall?